Welcome, friend. Settle in. Let the world soften around you for a while. If it's late where you are, let this story be the lantern that flickers beside your rest. And if it's early, may it carry you gently through the quiet moments before the noise returns. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. You can leave it in the comments, just so I know where these stories are landing. And if you'd like more of them, you know the ritual. Subscribe, leave a small mark, let the fold keep unfolding. Let me tell you about Tolan. No knight, no noble, no storied bloodline or banner. Just a man with soil beneath his nails, and an understanding of the world that only comes from never being invited to shape it. He was a serf, bound to the land, yes, but not owned, not exactly. Not like cattle, though some lords may have tried to blur the line. Tolan's father had tilled the same earth. His grandfather before that. Their freedom was a rumor, but their lives, intricately built on a balance that most modern people would call unbearable. And yet, there was room. Room to plant, room to raise children, room to grumble quietly about the absurdity of paying taxes on your own sweat. A luxury, really. He woke each day before light touched the sky, not from purpose, but habit. There was no time for existential dread. The cows needed feeding, the wheat needed turning, and Lord Drevin, whose greatest hardship was once losing a bet at dice, would need his due. But still, Tolan had something modern life rarely allows: certainty. He knew his place, knew the work, knew his neighbors would help repair his roof after a storm, not out of kindness, but because theirs might be next. He did not ask if life was fair. That question hadn't been invented yet. Once a month, the manor court gathered, a lopsided spectacle of justice, where peasants stood trial for letting their pigs wander, or for speaking too freely about the miller's suspicious grain weight. Tolan once appeared for stealing firewood, though stealing was generous, considering the forest had once belonged to his people's ancestors before a noble's whim declared otherwise. He paid a fine, grunted, and went back to cutting wood that same evening. Quiet resistance. That was a right too, if you knew how to disguise it as compliance. You see, the line between slave and serf wasn't so much a border as it was a fog, dense enough to obscure, thin enough to see through if you squinted. Slaves in many regions could be sold, broken, discarded. But a serf like Tolan, he was part of the estate, like a particularly mouthy fence post, or an ox with opinions. You couldn't sell him without selling the land. And no landowner wanted to be the one explaining to their lord why the field now came with no one to harvest it. Tolan had rights. Strange, patchwork, occasionally trampled rights, but they existed. And that, in the medieval world, was a quiet revolution in itself. Tolan wasn't free. Let's not romanticize the mud-caked truth. He couldn't pack his belongings, 3 wooden bowls and a chicken with attachment issues, and decide he'd rather try his luck in the next village over. No. His movements were tied to the land like ivy to stone. But here's the part that surprises most people. If his lord wanted to throw him off that land, he couldn't, not without good reason, not without the manorial court. And while that court leaned heavily in favor of the folks who owned wine cellars, not everyone walked away bruised. Some walked away with precedent. And precedent in the medieval world was just a fancier way of saying we're watching now. He shared his hut with his wife, Mirel, and their 3 children, all born into the same contract with the earth. They lived on a strip of land no wider than a cart's turn, but it was theirs to cultivate. Their own garden, their own hens, their own quiet, which is to say their own version of peace. Mirel once joked, dryly with eyes like steel, that at least they weren't slaves. Slaves couldn't marry legally, couldn't inherit, couldn't argue their case in court. However stacked the odds, we're not free, she'd say, but at least we're not invisible. And in a world where your lord couldn't remember your name, visibility was its own small rebellion. Serfdom meant you were part of a system that couldn't afford to lose you, You were the scaffolding, not the statue. You held things up. Tolan understood that. Lords wrote laws, knights made wars, but serfs, they made sure bread still existed. No harvest, no rent, no rent, no feasts, no feasts, no reason for nobles to be insufferable. He knew the hierarchy ran on his back, and sometimes when his spine ached too much to stand, he found an odd kind of satisfaction in that. You can call me low-born, he once said to a passing steward, but at least when I sweat it feeds someone. They could be taxed, heavily, ridiculously. Once they were even fined for not using the Lord's oven. Myrrel called that one the ash tax, and nearly got herself fined again for laughing too loudly at the steward. But even in that, there was structure. Serfs knew their dues, knew what would be taken, what might be left. Slaves, by contrast, had no contract, only commands, only whims, one wrong breath, and they could be sold. Tolan, for all his burdens, knew that his life couldn't be traded at market. His body belonged to no man. His labor, sure, his body, no. And that difference, thin as it was, mattered more than most people realize. He heard stories sometimes, whispered over fire, about men who had run, who had made it to a town and stayed long enough to become freemen. After a year and a day, they said, no one could claim you. Freedom was just 12 months and a miracle away. But Tolan never ran, not because he was afraid, because he had built something here, something with shape, with roots. And he knew something most modern folks don't. Rights, even muddy ones, grow slowly. They stretch between the cracks. They anchor. And sometimes when you've spent your life being called less, the quiet knowledge that you can't be bought is worth staying for. The seasons rolled over Tolan's life like slow tides, each one arriving with its own kind of demand. Spring was for planting, for watching the ground slowly admit it might give something back. Summer meant labor so hot and constant that even the flies gave up trying to land on you. Autumn, the great reveal, what had the earth decided you were worthy of? And winter, well, winter was for remembering, for surviving, for mending tools and speaking softly in candlelight about things no one dared to say in harvest months, about rights, about limits, about whether dignity was something you had to inherit or something you could quietly carve out for yourself between the taxes. Every now and then a decree would arrive from someone who'd never set foot in the village. A law passed by a man whose daily hardship involved deciding which belt matched his fur-trimmed cloak. One year the new order was that the serfs must pay an extra fee to use the forest paths. For their own protection, of course. From what? Myrrel asked. From the trees. She got fined. Again. But the next week someone no one knew who left a freshly skinned rabbit on the steward's doorstep with a folded cloth beneath it that simply read, "Bill me later." That was the thing about serfs. They didn't revolt often, but they were fluent in inconvenience. And still, Tolan's life had a structure modern people might envy. No endless job applications, no algorithms ranking his worth, no landlord raising rent just because he got bored. His rent was baked into the land itself, and if the lord tried to extract more than was agreed, the manorial court would hear about it. It might not go in Tolan's favor, but it had before. The system was flawed, yes, but it was a system. And when you've lived in a world where every outcome is determined by whim, even a crooked rulebook feels like a lifeline. There were customs, deep ones, binding in a way parchment never could be. If the lord died without heir, the villagers could collectively choose to buy their freedom from the estate. If a child was orphaned, the community took them in, not from charity but from understanding you protect the roots, not just the fruit. A serf could, under the right circumstances, marry without permission, could pass on land rights to their children, could save enough to buy their own release. None of these things were easy, but they were possible. And that, in the medieval world, was a rare and shimmering thing. Slaves, true slaves, were excluded from this possibility. They had no court to plead to, No land to pass down, no slow legal path to freedom. If they were freed, it was at the pleasure of their owner. A favor, a whim, a mercy disguised as justice. Tolan, on the other hand, could chart a way forward. Uneven, yes. Treacherous, often. But his story had chapters, not just pages torn from someone else's script. That mattered. Because even in a world designed to keep him in place, he had learned to shape the corners, to speak softly to the land, and listen when it answered. He belonged to no man. He belonged to the earth. And the earth, at least, gave back what you fed it. Tolan grew older, not with resentment, but with a kind of weary pride. His back ached, his hands cracked with years of harvest and frost, but he could walk the same paths he had as a child, and say, I helped shape this. He had outlived 2 stewards, 4 tax increases, and 1 small rebellion that lasted exactly 37 minutes before everyone realized no one had brought bread. He'd folded his life into the seams of the village, his sweat on the plow, his breath in the rafters of the grain barn, his quiet laugh in the space between complaint and contentment. Myrrel, still sharp-tongued and tireless, managed the household with the precision of a general and the sarcasm of someone who'd been paying the hearth tax for 30 years too long. When the steward's son tried to flirt with their daughter using a poem about wheat, she sent him home with a cloth-wrapped brick and a note that read, Here's something else from the field. The steward never mentioned it. He knew better. The serfs weren't powerless. They just had longer memories. And here's the irony, or maybe the quiet triumph. The same laws that kept them tied to the land also protected them from being thrown off it without cause. A noble might burn through his coffers in tournaments and wine, but when it came time to recoup losses, he couldn't simply evict Tolan, not without process, not without a murmur through the court, and a few other lords raising their eyebrows, because precedent was contagious. Serfs were not slaves. They were part of the estate, and a field without hands was just a patch of dirt no one could profit from. Tolan understood the game. He bent when needed, stood firm when it counted, and waited out the rest. The young men talked sometimes of change, of fleeing, of cities, of trade. He didn't stop them, but when they left, they always returned differently, eyes harder, shoulders higher. They'd seen what freedom looked like when it came with hunger. They'd learned that choice isn't always cheaper than duty, and some of them quietly found their way back to the village, took up tools again, and folded their dreams into a steadier life, one with less glory, but more bread. At night, Tolan sat by the fire and traced his thumb along the carved wood of the bench she'd made decades earlier. Myrrel would hum sometimes. The children were grown. The hut still stood, and outside the fields waited for spring like they always had. He thought of the difference between ownership and belonging, between being used and being needed, and in the silence that followed he allowed himself a thought modern minds might not understand. This wasn't freedom, but it wasn't nothing. And in that space between, in that gray, muddy, hard-earned in-between, there lived a kind of dignity that no one could tax away. The winter that Tolan turned 60 was one of those cruel, whispering winters, quiet, not dramatic, but persistent. Like a noble's complaint, always cold, always hungry, and deeply uninterested in your excuses. Still, the village endured. That's what they did. Not because they had a choice, but because they knew that endurance, at some point, becomes its own form of defiance. A kind of long, slow protest, written in firewood and stubborn survival. The Lord's steward came to collect the winter levy wearing boots worth more than Tolan's hut. Myrrel handed him the eggs and bread without a smile, without a word, but before he left, she passed him a folded cloth, small, unassuming. For your lord, she said. Inside, stitched with neat thread, we pay in silence, not submission. The steward didn't return the next month, and when he did, he brought fewer words and less attitude. Tolan suspected he got the message, or his lord did. Either way, no one was fined that winter for the chickens wandering. And while the nobles played at chivalry and the church argued about how many coins could fit inside a poor man's soul, the serfs quietly expanded their lives in ways no scribe ever recorded. A child was born, a fence mended, a song passed down about a pig that escaped 3 taxes in 1 year. These were not footnotes to history. They were the pages no one wrote, but everyone lived. There was a man named Benrick, who once claimed he'd found a legal loophole in the manor's charter, allowing him to refuse the cheese tax. It didn't go well. He was fined, ridiculed, and accidentally married off to the steward's niece, in a bizarre twist of drunken court ceremony. But years later, the cheese tax was quietly removed. No explanation. Just gone. Toland suspected Benrick's protest, ridiculous as it was, had worked. Sometimes rebellion doesn't look like fire. Sometimes it looks like someone saying, "No, actually, I think that's enough," with a goat tied to a tree behind them. As for Toland, he began to understand something deeper in those final years. That rights, as fragile and conditional as they were, had teeth. They didn't roar, they bit slowly, repeatedly, until even the lords took notice. And every time a serf remembered that they were owed at least that thin line of protection, that whisper of justice, they strengthened it. The fold grew tighter, not just across villages but across generations. And when his grandson once asked if they were free, Toland only smiled, leaned down and said, "No, lad, but we weren't forgotten." And some days that's the first step. Then he passed him the spade, and the boy took it, like a promise. Toland didn't leave behind scrolls or declarations. He wasn't the sort of man whose name would be carved into stone unless he did it himself out of boredom. What he left were paths, soft ones, walked over again and again until they meant something. Through his field, past the well, behind the chapel where the wild herbs grew. The kind of paths you follow without realizing, until one day you stop, look down and understand that someone came this way before you. Someone who endured and built and grumbled all the way through it. His rights, such as they were, lived in the practical. He could marry, own tools, pass land to his children, provided he paid the Harriet fee when he died, which was essentially the medieval version of your lord gets first pick of your stuff before your kids can touch it. Charming, really. But still, it meant the land stayed with the family. That mattered, especially when the world seemed allergic to letting poor people keep anything for long. Meryl outlived him. Naturally, she always said she would, if only out of spite. She kept the hut, kept the soil, kept the dry wit sharp enough to cut thatch. When the new steward came to renegotiate the village dues, she folded him a cloth, 1 stitch, 1 line. We remember everything. He didn't argue much after that. Sometimes a legacy isn't carved into banners. It's whispered behind doors and pinned to the wall beside the hearth. A fold, a phrase, a refusal to be erased. The other villagers spoke of Toland without ceremony. No titles, no myths, just the way you speak of weather that came and stayed long enough to change the crops. He was steady, they'd say. Didn't talk much. But when he did, you listened. A neighbor once said, "Toland's the reason I asked for a hearing at the manor court. Figured if he could do it without losing his teeth, maybe I could too." And that, more than anything, was how rights endured. Not through parchment, but through courage passed like bread between hands that had known hunger. Today we think of freedom as absolute or useless. Either you have it all, or you're trapped. But Toland knew better. He knew what it meant to claim small space within a cruel system, to be bound to a field, and still stand straight when the Lord passed by. He wasn't free, but he had lines drawn in the dirt, and when someone tried to cross them, he made sure they noticed. Sometimes by speaking, sometimes by simply staying. And in the quiet where law failed, dignity took root anyway. That's not just survival, that's resistance, stitched into silence and folded for the next person to find. There are things that aren't written in law books, but are carved into the backs of hands. Tolan knew them all, knew that when the steward came with a new decree, the real terms weren't in the ink, they were in the faces of the villagers. If no one flinched, it would pass. If Merrill scoffed too loudly, it might get revisited. If the blacksmith folded his arms and didn't speak, everyone took a half step closer to refusal. These were the quiet negotiations of survival. Not glamorous, not revolutionary, but they worked. Not always quickly, but often enough to matter. The manorial court, for all its pomp and tilted scales, wasn't just a formality. It was the medieval version of a very specific kind of theater, public, performative, and vaguely terrifying. Serfs like Tolan were allowed to bring complaints, and sometimes, only sometimes, they even won. Not because justice demanded it, but because precedent was a creature even lords had to bow to on occasion. If 5 villagers complained about unfair tithes and the court dismissed them all, that was order. If 20 complained and a neighboring manor heard about it, that was potential unrest. And unrest, like a poorly cooked stew, tended to simmer too long before anyone realized it had burned the bottom of the pot. Tolan once stood before the court to argue that the grain mill was measuring unfairly. He wasn't the first to notice, but he was the first to bring it up after the last man who tried mysteriously fell into a well. He came alone. Muriel said she would have gone too, but she'd rather argue with a beehive. The steward read the complaint out loud with the bored tone of a man who had never harvested a thing in his life. The lord, fatter than last season, waved a hand and asked Tolan if he had proof. Just bread that doesn't rise. And neighbors who do, Tolan replied. A chuckle from the crowd. Just one, but enough. They didn't rule in his favor. Not really. They said the measurement would be reviewed, which meant we'll forget about this until someone else complains louder. But for the next few weeks, the scale at the mill read a little heavier, and the steward's smirk seemed just a bit thinner. Sometimes winning meant the system nudged toward fairness for a moment before slouching back into its usual posture. But a nudge was better than nothing. A nudge, over time, could shift a mountain, if you had the patience to keep pushing with your shoulder every time you passed it. Muriel said once, that being a serf was like being a cat in a church, technically not allowed, barely tolerated, but useful enough that no one dared throw you out unless you scratched the wrong person. She said it with a smirk, while sewing a patch on Tolan's tunic with thread so rough, it may as well have been wire. Better to be an essential inconvenience, she added, than a noble's hobby. And that was the secret. The lords needed them. Not as people, never that, but as labor, as routine, as silence that made the gears of hierarchy spin without protest. And the more the serfs understood this, the more leverage they had, not in power but in presence. There was power in being expected, in knowing that if you didn't show up to till the fields, the harvest would suffer, that if no one paid the oven fee, the Lord's bread wouldn't rise, that if the village was empty tomorrow, the manor would collapse under its own indifference. Tolan knew this. He walked through life like someone who could not change the world, but could stall it for a moment if he stood still long enough. That kind of defiance was quieter than swords, but more lasting. And it wasn't just about labor, it was about lineage. Tolan could not be sold apart from the land. That meant something. Slaves could be traded, sold on whims or debts, but a serf was an asset tied to geography, to fields, to legacy. You couldn't rip him from the dirt without destabilizing everything around it. And so, over time, his roots became his armor. He couldn't run, but he couldn't be removed either. That strange, bitter contract, that double-edged loyalty, became a kind of strange security, like a tree too old to chop down, but too vital to ignore. Tolan's grandchildren grew up under the same thatched roof where he had first learned to listen before speaking, and like most children, they asked questions. The adults didn't have time to ask anymore. Why do we give food to the Lord when we're the ones who grew it? Or, why can't we build our own mill and just not tell them? And the favorite, if the forest is right there, "Why can't we use the wood?" To which Merrill always replied, "Because someone important once said so, and no one with a sword has bothered to ask if it still makes sense." That usually ended the conversation, though, not the wondering. And yet, within those limitations, there was an order and understanding passed down not through law, but through routine. If someone's roof gave in, you helped. If a child lost a parent, you fed them, not because of kindness, because one day it would be your child, your roof, your fire gone cold. These unwritten rules had more weight than royal decrees because they were real, because they worked, because when the rest of the world saw you as replaceable, it mattered that someone remembered your name long after your body forgot how to bend without pain. One spring, after a harsh winter that left most pantries echoing, a new edict arrived, an additional tax for defense. Defense against what was unclear. Bandits? The French? A vague sense of divine disappointment? No one knew, but the tax came anyway. The steward arrived on horseback, always a good sign that something awful was about to be said politely. He read the decree with the bored authority of someone who had never truly needed anything. When he finished, there was a long silence. Toland, then nearly 70 and moving slower than frost, stood with his hands behind his back and said, "We've already paid for the land once, with our backs. You're just collecting interest now." The steward laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh, but it was nervous, and when he left, he did so with fewer coins than expected, and a cloth tied around his saddle horn stitched by Muriel, of course. It read, "The field does not forget who tramples it." The tax still happened, but it was lightened 2 years later, after reports of dwindling productivity and unrest among the more literate villages. Change, even the faintest kind, always came with delay, but it came. And that was the strange thing. There were levers, hidden in plain sight. Serfs could not vote, could not read most of what was written about them, but they could shape the rhythm of power through resistance that looked like routine. A delayed planting, a silent chapel, a harvest just light enough to raise a question, but not enough to raise suspicion. Sabotage, sure, but subtle. Measured, denied with a shrug and a calloused hand. Poor season, my lord. The rains came late. We did what we could. It's hard to punish the weather. Toland didn't consider himself clever. He didn't think of what he did as strategy, but the truth was, he had mastered the art of making himself unavoidable. That was the real power of being bound to the land, not freedom, but permanence. They couldn't throw him out. They couldn't afford to. His absence would create more work than his presence ever did. So he stayed, and stayed. And each year that staying became its own kind of protest. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He endured. And in the face of a world that depended on forgetting people like him, he made sure to be remembered, not through legacy, but through presence. Because presence was a kind of rebellion. In a time where slaves could be sold with the snap of a purse string, Toland's presence had to be negotiated, respected at least in the way landlords respect a foundation they can't quite knock down. The nobles held the titles, but the serfs held the ground. And some days that was enough to shift the balance, not by inches, but by grains of soil that refused to be moved without a price. One of the more absurd realities of medieval life, besides the fact that cheese could be a taxable event and rain could be blamed on moral failure, was that freedom was not a yes or no question. It was a sliding scale of obligations and expectations, measured not in gold but in how many people noticed when you stopped showing up. And on that scale, Toland was strangely rich. He could not vote, but his absence could delay a harvest. He could not own the land, but his death would cost the lord a season's labor and the administrative headache of transferring tenancy to his son. In a world obsessed with bloodlines and banners, serfs like him were a kind of quiet royalty, the kind you didn't bow to, but absolutely needed when your livestock fell ill. He often walked his land at dusk, the 1 hour of the day when even lords forgot to pretend they cared. Meryl sometimes joined him, dragging a stool when her knees refused to cooperate. "You ever think about what comes after this?" she asked once. Not out of fear, but out of that resigned curiosity you get when you've spent decades being a footnote to someone else's prosperity. Tolan didn't answer immediately. He watched the wind move through the wheat and said, "I think what we leave behind isn't a story, it's a pattern. And if we fold it just right, someone else might find it useful." Meryl snorted. "That sounds like something you'd embroider on a blanket and then sleep under it so no one else can read it." He chuckled. "Well, maybe." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "We've been poor our whole lives, Tolan, but never useless. That counts for something." And it did. Because in a world where being poor usually meant being disposable, being needed was a kind of armor, not the shiny kind, but the kind that made people hesitate before trying to shove you out of the way. The younger serfs started to notice too. They watched how Tolan responded to injustice, not with loud revolt, but with stillness that made the stewards nervous. He wouldn't shout when a new rule came down. He'd simply pause in a way that made others stop working too. It was accidental at first, then it became custom. They called it Tolan's pause. Whenever something felt unjust, a new grain tithe, an unfair punishment, they'd stop for just a moment longer than usual. Enough to signal discontent without speaking it. Enough to feel the weight of their own presence in a system built to ignore it. The manner began changing, subtly. The stewards started arriving with softer language, in cooperation with your continued productivity. A small adjustment for the health of the estate. He still took what he came for, but he took it with the awareness that the laborers weren't just bodies, they were pressure points. And pressure, if ignored long enough, becomes fracture. Tolan never claimed credit. He never gave speeches, but he knew what was happening. He had become the blueprint for quiet disruption, the kind you build with calloused hands and sharp glances. There was a harvest festival one year, more of an excuse to drink without guilt than any actual celebration. And Tolan was asked to speak. That had never happened before. He stood in the square, hands behind his back, the same posture he used when pretending to listen to the steward. He looked around at the faces, lined and young, tired and bright, hungry and full of song, and said, "We are not free, but we are rooted, and roots hold things up, even when no one thanks them." Then he sat down and drank cider like it hadn't cost him everything to say that out loud. Later that night, someone left a folded cloth beside his door. No name, no stitch, just a fold, careful and deliberate. He kept it, not because it meant something in the way nobles might write it down, but because someone somewhere had heard him. And in that small gesture he saw the future, not of freedom maybe, but of awareness, of generations who would grow up understanding they were not just part of the estate, they were the shape of it. And that shape, once recognized, could never be flattened again. Tolan lived long enough to see himself become a question in other people's stories. Why did he stay? Why didn't he leave when others ran? What did he think was worth holding on to? These questions usually came from the younger ones, the ones who had never known famine bad enough to thin your breath, or lords bold enough to raise taxes the same week they threw a feast visible from your window. Tolan never minded the questions. Questions meant someone still believed in different outcomes. But he never gave a full answer, because answers are fixed. And Tolan's entire life had been built on learning to live with the bend. One evening, as autumn painted everything the color of fatigue, his eldest granddaughter sat beside him with a piece of cloth in her lap. She was learning to fold the way her grandmother had, slowly with fingers that understood fabric the way a farmer understands soil. She said, "Is this what freedom looks like? This folding? This waiting?" Tolan didn't answer right away. He took the cloth from her hands, folded it once more, and said, "It's not freedom, but it's a way of not disappearing. And that matters more than most people know." She nodded, folded another, didn't speak. That too was part of the learning. In truth, Tolan had never believed in freedom the way poets described it. Golden, loud, absolute. He believed in the freedom to plant the same row without someone changing your dues mid-season. In the freedom to laugh without looking over your shoulder. In the freedom to say no, even if only once a year, in a court designed to misunderstand you. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the fire from going out entirely. That was the gift of his station. Not luxury, not autonomy, but just enough stability to pass something on that couldn't be taxed or torn down. Because here's the part no one likes to admit. Slaves, real slaves, in many corners of that world, didn't even get that. They were assets, commodities. Their children were owned. Their bodies could be sold, punished, bred, discarded. The serf, however, bent beneath his duties, still had the thread of recognition, a name in the manor roll, a say, however small, in village custom. He was bound, yes, but not erased. Tolan knew that. He didn't wear it like a badge. He wore it like an old bruise you press sometimes, just to remind yourself what you've survived. There were rules about what lords could demand, not always followed, but they existed. And when those rules were broken, when rents were raised beyond reason, or a child threatened with conscription before their first frost, the villagers responded, not with torches, but with silence, with fields suddenly slow to till, with animals that wandered farther, with children mysteriously too ill for service. Tolan had taught them that, not by command, but by example, how to use the slow refusal, how to stretch presence into resistance, how to say we are not slaves without ever raising your voice. And the stewards, for all their posturing, noticed. They might scoff, might fine someone for insolence or disrespecting feudal order, but they never pushed too far, because even the manor needed rhythm, and Tolan had become the drumbeat, predictable, reluctant, essential. In the later years, the steward who replaced the last steward who had dared question Merrill came with smaller asks, politer language. He even used the word please once. Merrill had laughed so hard she had to sit down. Tolan just nodded. Change, after all, wasn't about revolution. It was about pressure, sustained, quiet, relentless. And in the final days when Tolan's legs no longer trusted the ground and the harvest looked like someone else's problem, he sat in the corner of the hut, folding cloth without purpose, just shape, just rhythm, just to keep the hands remembering. He gave one to his youngest great-grandchild and said, "If you forget everything else, just remember how this feels." The child asked what it meant. Tolan said, "It means I was here." And that, in the end, was the right he had fought hardest for, not to be free, but to not be forgotten. Tolan passed on a fog-heavy morning, the kind that quiets even the birds. There was no formal mourning, no tolling of bells, no noble eulogy, just the sound of boots on damp earth as neighbors came and went, some with bundles of wheat, others with strips of cloth, folded and left quietly on the step. Merrill didn't cry in front of them. She sat beside the fire, staring into the coals like she was reading something only she could see. When someone finally asked if she wanted help gathering his things, she said, "He wasn't things, he was a weight, and it's still here." They buried him on the edge of the land he'd never owned, but had shaped more intimately than any title holder ever could. Not beneath a stone, but beside an old tree. One he'd planted the same season his second son was born. That tree had outlived frost, flood, and one steward who thought it blocked the view from the manor. It would outlive them too. Merrill tied one of his folded cloths to a low branch and muttered something under her breath. No one asked what she said. In those moments, translation is unnecessary. The gesture speaks. The younger ones asked if there'd be a marker, something carved, something that could be read. Merrill shook her head. "He was read while he lived," she said. "Every field, every wall, every story you carry with you. That's the marker. That's what lasts." And she was right. because within days, others started folding more often. Not out of grief, but continuity. A message here, a thought there, left under doorsteps, tucked in baskets, slipped into pockets with no explanation. One simply read, "He stayed, so we know we can too." It was strange, the way his absence reshaped the village, not by changing things, but by reminding people how they'd held together all along. The steward came with his usual demands a few weeks later and found a dozen villagers already waiting, calm, straight-backed, not rude, but present in a way that made him hesitate. Myrrel was at the front. She handed him a folded cloth without speaking. It said, "The ones who stay long enough become the ones you answer to." He didn't argue, just nodded and left. The tax stayed the same that year, a small victory, but real. Myrrel lasted another winter, then another. She outlived the next harvest, 2 more edicts, and a pig so stubborn it had to be bribed into its own pen. She folded every morning, sometimes with thread, sometimes just with breath. She taught the children how to stitch without poking themselves, how to hold fabric like it might speak. When asked why she folded cloth every day, she said, "Because remembering is work, and work needs rhythm." When she passed, they buried her beside Tolan. Same tree, same quiet, same kind of morning that feels like it's holding its breath. The tree grew fuller in the years that followed. Cloths appeared every season. Some stayed, some vanished. One day a traveler came through, a woman with tired eyes and a bag that looked like it had been patched more than it had been made. She tied a cloth to the tree. No name, no message, but the fold was careful, exact. The kind only someone taught by someone who folded with love would know. She stayed a few nights, helped repair a roof, shared bread, then she left before dawn. No one asked her name, they just called her part of it. And that's how Tolan lived on. Not in legend, not in record, but in repetition, in folds passed down, in silent pauses when something unfair was asked, in the way someone might say, "I think that's enough for today," and everyone would know what they meant. He had not been free, but he had shaped the rules of his captivity into something worth inheriting, a kind of resistance, humble and enduring, a life that said, "You may bind me, but you will not forget me, and neither will the ones who come next." The cloths became more than memory. They became language, not spoken, written, but without letters. Shape became speech. Placement became punctuation. A fold left at the baker's counter said, "You fed us when the steward forgot." One tied to the well said, "We're watching how you draw from us." A strip of linen on a child's cloak might carry nothing at all but the weight of lineage of having come from people who knew how to fold something small into something that mattered. There was no one in the village who claimed to have invented this. No scribe, no priest, no clerk, and yet everyone understood it, especially those who lived closest to the edge. The woman who'd lost her husband to the plague and still came to sing during harvest. The boy with the crooked spine who couldn't plow but remembered every story passed around the fire. The old man who never spoke unless someone asked the right kind of question. These were not leaders. They were roots. And roots, as Tolan once said, are quiet, but they hold the entire forest together. A steward once brought in a new clerk, fresh from the city, to modernize the collection process. He walked into the village wearing boots that had never touched mud, and an attitude that reeked of parchment and overconfidence. He spoke of new tallies, new quotas, new systems. No one interrupted. No one argued. But the next morning, every field was empty, not abandoned, just paused. The baker made no bread. The blacksmith stood beside his forge with arms crossed. Even the cows seemed slower, as if they understood the moment required solidarity. The steward asked what had happened. The answer came in the form of cloth, 33 folded pieces, left at the manor gate. No names, no direct threats, but one of them, stitched in plain thread, said, "We're not free. But we're not fools." The clerk left 2 weeks later. The steward never mentioned modernization again, and the fields returned to life as if nothing had happened. Because that's how the fold worked, not by shouting, by remaining. The cloths began to travel beyond the village. Traders passed them between wagons. One made it to a monastery, tucked into a sack of flour. The monk who found it unfolded a message that read, "Not all prayers come from silence. Some come from standing very still and not backing down." He kept it, not for theology, for comfort, for understanding. He began folding his own, slipping them into books, between candles beneath doors where no one wanted to speak but someone clearly needed to be heard. It said one of the cloths reached a manor, far to the north, where the lord, a cruel man known for bleeding his serfs dry, opened a folded square to find, "The more you squeeze, the faster we slip through." He was furious, demanded answers, burned it in his hearth. But the next week, another appeared, this one sewn into the lining of his saddlebag. He doubled the guard, but somehow a third appeared tucked into his wine flask. The land is not yours. It just lets you borrow power. No one ever found out who placed them. He left the manor a year later, sick, weaker, quiet. Some say it was illness. Others say it was the weight of being seen. Back in Toland's village, life continued. Muddy, rhythmic, flawed. Children were born and taught how to plant straight rows and how to fold straight corners. A new steward came, young and nervous, and the village didn't fold in protest. Not yet. They watched, waited, folded only in greeting. We're still here. We remember who we are. That was enough, for now. Because the fold, like the people who shaped it, didn't move fast. It didn't rise up. It settled in, and once it did, it never left. The next generation didn't ask whether folding was necessary. They asked when. It had become part of the rhythm of the village. You tilled the field, gathered the grain, folded the cloth. It was no longer protest. It was practice, like breathing after running, like watching the sky before deciding when to plant. The fold wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Its power came from its patience, its refusal to fade. Ada, one of Morel's granddaughters, kept a basket of folds beneath her bed. Not messages, not stitched, just blank, ready. She said it made her feel prepared. "You never know when you'll need to say something you can't say out loud," she told her children. And when her husband fell from the cart and broke his leg, too early in the season to rest, too late to avoid disaster, she folded a square and left it on the steward's stoop. "If we fail, so do you." The steward came the next morning with 2 other men, and quietly helped finish the planting. He didn't speak of the fold, but he left with his hands dirty. One of Ada's sons, Bram, took the fold beyond the village. He left at 19, feet too eager, heart too swollen, with stories of towns that welcomed anyone with strong arms. He found work in a nearby town, laboring on stone roads meant to impress lords too busy drinking to ever walk on them. The pay was fair, the silence unfair. When a younger boy was struck for asking for his bread early, Bram didn't shout. He folded a napkin left on the overseer's table. You can't build a road if no one shows up to walk it. 3 men didn't show the next day, then 5, then 11. By the end of the week, the overseer was replaced, quietly, without scandal. The folding had followed Bram, or perhaps it had never left him. Elsewhere, the folds became symbols without explanation. A cloth pinned to a church door wasn't seen as vandalism anymore. It was a request, a reminder, a warning. One town began folding into shapes: stars for grief, circles for injustice, triangles for shared burden. It was never codified. No one wrote a guide. And yet somehow, across villages and seasons, people understood. Someone could arrive, leave a folded triangle beneath the communal oven, and bread would appear at their door that evening. No speech, no barter, just recognition. The fold had become its own vocabulary. It wasn't just serfs. Tradespeople, once ignored by lords unless their carts broke in the manor yard, began folding too. One shoemaker placed a cloth inside each pair of boots for a noble who hadn't paid on time. "You don't walk without us," the message spread. Another blacksmith folded messages into the lining of a ceremonial sword. "This gleams because I bled for it." A tanner stitched a fold to the inside of a saddle used by a knight infamous for cruelty. "May your horse throw you before the people do." No one was caught. No one confessed. And yet, the tone shifted. In the capital, rumors began to swirl. Courtiers spoke of the cloth messages with disdain and a little fear. Some claimed they were curses. Others called them peasant poetry. One noblewoman scoffed until she found a fold beneath her jeweled cushion that read, "You don't sit without the rest of us kneeling." After that, she began tipping more generously. People noticed, and the folds kept coming. Back in the village, the tree where Tolan was buried had grown so wide that 3 children could sit under it during summer and not be touched by sun or sound. They didn't know him, but they knew what he'd done. They didn't speak of his deeds like a story. They treated him like a direction. One of them said, "If it ever gets bad again, we'll fold first." And the others nodded, not because they understood everything, but because they trusted the cloth would speak when their mouths couldn't. That was the truth of it. Tolan hadn't built a movement. He'd left behind a habit, a reflex, a way to say no with your hands when your voice wasn't safe. And centuries later, people still felt that shape in their palms. In a village far from Tolan's tree, where the soil was drier and the houses built with stone instead of timber, an old woman named Thara kept a collection of folded cloths in a wooden chest beneath her bed. She didn't call them heirlooms. She didn't call them relics. She called them the reasons. No one questioned her. She'd lived through 2 bad winters, one famine, and a short-lived rebellion that began when a steward tried to tax the water from the village well. The rebellion ended when the steward mysteriously lost a tooth during a fall, and everyone swore they hadn't seen anything. But the message stuck: push us hard enough, and we remember how to push back. Thara's cloths weren't decorative. They were messages folded so many times the creases were part of the weave. One said, "You'll break before we do." Another, "We bend so we don't snap, but don't test the angle." She unfolded them occasionally, not to reread, but to remind her hands how to make the fold tight. "There's a rhythm to resistance," she'd say. "You have to keep the shape or the meaning gets lost." When her granddaughter asked if folding was still necessary, now that things were calmer, Thara just handed her a blank square. "Fold it anyway," she said, "even when it's quiet. Especially then." Because quiet, as everyone who'd ever lived long under someone else's boot knew, was not peace. It was the part of the storm where everyone pretended the sky didn't just flinch, and folding during quiet meant you remembered that you kept the habit of not disappearing even when no one was looking. In towns where the lords no longer showed their faces, and stewards had learned to send letters instead of orders, cloth still turned up at gates, in ovens, in baskets, in shoes, sometimes with ink, sometimes with blood, sometimes just folded, blank like a breath held for someone else. In one coastal town, a merchant tried to raise rents so sharply that half the fishermen couldn't afford bait. Instead of revolt, the townsfolk began leaving folded cloths, wrapped around spoiled fish, setting them neatly at the merchant's front door each morning. The message was clear. It took 3 days before he lowered the rate. He never admitted why, but one morning, a single fold appeared on his windowsill. "This isn't over. It's just paused." He moved 2 months later, no announcement. Just gone. His replacement arrived and made no changes. The people folded a thank you, left it under his tea. And it wasn't only the poor anymore. Even scribes and monks had begun to use the fold. They hid messages in bindings and stitched lines into robes. "God may be watching, but so are we." Some said it was heresy. Others called it solidarity. One friar smuggled folded cloths to nearby villages and loaves of bread, each marked with prayers rewritten in plain language. Blessed are the meek, but louder are the tired. His abbey didn't find out for years. By then the folds had already reached a dozen towns and turned into a kind of unspoken prayer. A child born into one of these villages would learn to fold before they could read. It wasn't formal education. It was inherited reflex, like looking both ways on a quiet road, like knocking before entering, like listening before speaking. The fold became part of growing up, a way to name emotions too dangerous to say out loud, a way to speak across silence, a way to say, I saw what they did to you and you didn't deserve it. Some folded in secret, others in ceremony, but all of them, whether they knew the name Tolan or not, were bending the cloth in the shape of his staying. And maybe that was the miracle. He was never famous, never knighted, never recorded in any book, kept safe behind cathedral walls. But his life had stretched, not wide but far, through corners and kitchens and campsites, through places that didn't yet have a word for resistance. And in every fold that tightened in quiet defiance, there was his echo. You don't have to be free to be powerful. You just have to remember that you matter, even when they forget that in the end was the truth they couldn't burn. Because cloth doesn't scream, it stays, it wraps, it waits. Some folds ended up in places that never would have allowed them if they'd known. A scroll chamber in a noble's manor, a cathedral archive, even the sleeve of a knight's ceremonial robe. No one ever admitted how they got there, but they stayed as quietly persistent as dust. One was found centuries later, tucked into the lining of an old tax record. It read, "You built your kingdom on our backs. We remember where the stones came from." The archivist who found it didn't report it. He folded it again, placed it in a different book, and smiled. In a high court once filled with powdered wigs and perfumed indignation, a noble family stumbled upon a bundle of folded cloths buried in the cellar wall of their estate. They were yellowed with age, the ink faded, the thread rough. One cloth bore a single line, "Your wine tastes better when you remember who harvested the grapes." Another simply said, "You were rich, we were necessary." The nobles said nothing publicly, but later that year they quietly raised the wages of their tenants. Not because they feared revolt, because they feared shame. The kind of shame that lingers long after the feast ends. The folds never needed leaders. That was their greatest strength. No one to kill, no figure to discredit, no center to burn, just countless hands, folding quietly, in the dark, in the fields, in the kitchens. Behind the curtain of every great historical moment, someone had a cloth tucked in their sleeve, and even when the cloth wasn't there, the idea was folded into the mind, pressed into the heart. I will not vanish. I will not bow farther than I must. I will outlast you, because I have nothing left to lose, and everything worth keeping still inside me. At some point, the nobles tried to co-opt it, as they always do. They tried to fold as fashion. Fancy linens folded into ridiculous shapes and tied with gold thread at dinners where the roast pheasant cost more than a peasant's yearly rent. But something felt wrong, hollow, because the fold had never been about flourish. It had been about function, about protest, about persistence. And no matter how intricate they made it, it never quite carried the same weight, because you cannot buy history with a centerpiece. Meanwhile, the villages kept folding, not for attention, not even for change, some of the time, just because it was theirs, because it had always been theirs. On bad years, when the rains ruined the crops, or when the steward drank too much and swung his authority like a dull blade, the folds increased. They appeared like mushrooms after rain. One stitched with care said, "We're hungry, but not too hungry to wait you out." Another, left near the church altar, whispered, "He may be your Lord, but God heard our side first, And in a strange way, those folds kept people going. They were small, stubborn proof that someone else was still awake, still resisting, still here. It wasn't always dramatic. Often, the folds were just acts of care. A cloth left by a widow's door, "You are not forgotten." A fold given to a midwife who had lost a child in the night. You still carried hope. A fold passed from hand to hand in the market, stitched only with, "This is heavy. Let me hold part of it." No sermons, no speeches, just presence. And in a world constantly rearranging itself to keep the powerful comfortable, presence became the most radical thing of all. Back under Toland's tree, the trunk had grown thick, knotted with time. The cloths left there now faded faster in the sun, but no one removed them. They frayed, they discolored, they stayed. One cloth, recently added, carried no words, just a handprint, small, pressed in ash. It said more than language could. A child had folded that. Someone who hadn't read Toland's name but had felt his shape in the way their mother stood still when spoken to unfairly. That was how history lived, not in the books, not in the monuments, but in the habits of those who had once been told they mattered least, and folded anyway. The fold didn't need to be explained anymore. That was how you knew it had become real. A child dropped a folded cloth at a neighbor's door and walked away without a word. A woman folded one before sweeping her doorstep, tucking it beneath the corner of her mat like a charm. In cities, people began finding them in alleyways, tied to lampposts, pinned inside public notices like afterthoughts with too much weight. The shape of the fold said what mouths could not. We're still watching, we're still here. In one village, an apprentice stonemason folded a cloth and slipped it between bricks in a new church wall. He didn't write anything, just folded it tight and left it sealed in mortar. When asked why, he said, "Because no one will remember me, but maybe the wall will." The others laughed, but one older mason went quiet. He'd done the same years before, folded a cloth and buried it beneath the manor steps. "I built this. You owe me more than a nod." He never told anyone until now. That's what the fold did. It made truth visible, even if only to the ones who'd already lived it. The nobles never really understood it. They thought the fold was a code, a secret language. They searched for patterns, hired scribes, questioned messengers, but they were looking for something to control, something to outlaw, and the fold didn't work that way. You couldn't outlaw a silence, couldn't punish someone for placing linen under a tree or wrapping a loaf of bread a little tighter than usual. You couldn't jail a gesture. And so the fold kept spreading, not because it was legal, because it was impossible to kill. One young lord fresh from the university tried to engage with the fold intellectually. He invited villagers to explain what the fold meant, promised not to punish, promised understanding. They declined, politely, left him a fold the next morning on his writing desk. It read, "When you understand without asking, you'll deserve to know." He never asked again, but he began walking the village more slowly. He stopped interrupting. He started listening when he thought no one saw. And when he died, someone no one knew who left a folded cloth on his grave. You learned late, but you learned. In winter, the folds took on new meaning. They became warmth, wrapped around aching joints, shared between neighbors when blankets were thin, stitched with reminders, "We survived last time, we will again." Some were soaked in soup before being handed off, a quiet offering that said, "Eat, don't argue." Others bore names of the dead, not as mourning but as anchoring, so they wouldn't drift away in memory, so the ones who carried on could remember they weren't carrying alone. A traveling minstrel picked up the habit too. He didn't fold cloths, he folded songs, verses tucked into refrains, stitched with lines pulled from the folds he'd seen. The Lord holds the land, but the hands shape the season. She folded silence into power. You forgot who fed you. He wasn't subtle. He wasn't punished either, because every village wanted him, and no steward wanted to be the one who silenced the singer who left them just enough dignity to feel generous. By the time another century passed, no one could say exactly where the fold had started, which meant it belonged to everyone. It had moved beyond protest, beyond survival. It had become culture, a living thread inside daily life, still sharp when needed, still a quiet threat if crossed, but also gentle. Present, a way to remember how many people had once stood in the same patch of dirt and decided not to disappear. And that, more than any parchment or proclamation, had kept the structure from fully collapsing. Not honor, not charity, not law, but cloth, folded, held, passed on. The cloth had outlived kings. That was the part no one liked to admit. Not the clergy, who spent entire sermons pretending only prayer kept the realm intact. Not the lords, who assumed their names mattered more than the hands who whispered them when no one else dared. But it was true. Regimes changed, wars came and went, plagues took thousands, but the fold remained, not because it was powerful, but because it was necessary. In a world that shifted like mud in spring, the fold was the one thing that could be shaped by anyone. No ink, no permission, just intention and fabric. A midwife named Rona kept a box of them under her bed, folded by patients who couldn't pay or couldn't speak or didn't survive. She didn't unfold them, said it wasn't her place. "They're not mine," she told the blacksmith's daughter once. "They're just passing through me." On the day the steward's wife lost her child, Rona stayed through the night. Didn't charge, didn't fold. But when she left, a cloth was found on the edge of the bed, stitched only with "even those with names must learn what it means to be held without question." The steward never asked who placed it, but he paid Rona double for her next visit, and did not speak during it. And still some folds never made it into baskets or under doors. They were carried, worn, hidden. A knight once tied one into his gauntlet before battle, not for protection, but to remind himself why he returned. It bore no words, but the thread had been worn down by fingers, smoothed by use. He was never asked about it, but when he fell, and his squire found the cloth still knotted beneath the metal, he took it and tied it to his own. That squire never rose in rank, but he kept the cloth, and later when his son asked what it meant, he said, "It's from someone who refused to forget." Isas, Destavias, it's from someone who refused to forget. The church, slow to catch up, eventually tried to bless the fold. A bishop declared them symbols of humility, wrapping the gesture in scripture and ceremony, and maybe that worked. For a while. Maybe it brought comfort to those who needed divine approval to keep doing what had always worked. But most villagers folded anyway. Before the blessing, during it, after. The fold didn't need permission. That's what made it matter. And it had shape. That was important. When the world felt shapeless, ruled by hunger, taxes, war, pestilence, the fold gave form to helplessness. A way to hold fear and say, "I see you, but you do not get to swallow me." That mattered. That gave breath. Because when you are poor and tired and watched too closely, shape is everything. It's why soldiers march, why nobles build gates, and why a peasant, given only minutes between chores, still chooses to press a corner and smooth it down, because that's power. Even if it looks like housekeeping, the children still learned it. Not from books, from watching. A girl saw her mother fold after her brother was taken for war. A boy saw his grandmother fold after the taxman left. They watched how hands moved, how cloth was held like something sacred, even when it was just torn linen. They practiced, sometimes badly. The folds were uneven, the stitches sloppy, but no one corrected them, because the point was never perfection. The point was to begin, again, and again, and again. And still, somewhere, always, someone found one, left on a grave, beneath a table, tied to the gate of a field now overgrown, and they would know without needing to ask, this mattered. Someone stood here, Someone stayed, and for a moment the silence became less frightening. It became shared. In a coastal village where the fog clung to everything, windows, fishing nets, lungs, a man named Hal kept a folded cloth in his coat pocket. Not for protest, not for poetry, for luck, he claimed. The cloth had no words, just a single stitch, shaped like a wave. When asked where it came from, he shrugged. My mother, or maybe her mother. But every time a storm came and the boats didn't, he'd stand at the edge of the water and hold it tight. Once, when the catch was bad and the taxes worse, someone found him standing there for hours, thumb pressed to the cloth, like he was praying. He wasn't. He was remembering. That's what the fold became for many. Not a rebellion, but a memory too stubborn to die. A resistance to erasure, because the world, especially for those born poor, tried to forget you fast. If you didn't owe someone money or labor, you were invisible. The fold refused that. It said, I existed. I felt this. I left something behind, even if all I had was linen and a minute of silence. And that was enough. That was everything. Hal's daughter, Mira, started folding when she was young, but her folds were different. She folded with thread, not stitched into messages, but into maps, tiny trails. She'd leave them around the village on fence posts, under eaves tucked into tree hollows. Each one pointed somewhere, nowhere special, just places where something had happened, where her father had cried once, where a neighbor had collapsed, where a stranger had said something kind. She called it her memory walk, and the folds made those places matter. They didn't become sacred, just remembered. When the steward's son came through, young, overeager, with the unfortunate confidence of someone who thought empathy was a negotiating tactic, he tried to make a joke about the cloths. Don't you all get tired of playing at secrets? He asked Mira, gesturing to one of her maps. She didn't reply. She folded a square and handed it to him. Inside, not all secrets are for you. It was the kind of silence that closes a door without slamming it. He didn't mention the cloths again. The fold had boundaries too, unspoken rules. You didn't unfold someone else's unless invited. You didn't fake a fold, and you never ever mocked them, at least not where anyone could hear you. Because for all their softness, they carried weight. The kind of weight that kept people standing when it would have been easier to fall. A boy once stole one and laughed about it. The next day, his chores were left undone by every hand in the village. Bread didn't appear at his door. The smith turned him away. He returned the cloth quietly. No lecture, just consequence. That's how the fold taught, through shape, not scolding. In time, folds began showing up in the places people least expected them. A courtroom floor, a noble's carriage, once even sewn into the hem of a wedding dress. That one read, "You can love someone and still remember who you were before." The bride never admitted who left it, but she walked with her head higher that day. And later, when her husband left for war and never came back, she kept folding, not in grief, in recognition of how strong she had always been. Hal died with the cloth, still in his pocket. Mira kept it, didn't refold it, just placed it in a small wooden box with others, one from her mother, one from a friend who had drowned too young, one she had folded herself during a winter that nearly starved the entire coast. None of them had words, but when she opened the box on bad days, the weight of them kept her upright. Not because they solved anything, but because they proved she had made it through before, and she could again. With nothing but cloth and memory and the quiet insistence that no one, not lords, not stewards, not even time, would take her shape away. In a town wrapped around a river, where fish kept most families fed, and the occasional flood reminded everyone who was really in charge, there lived a woman named Lysa, who folded cloth the way other people breathed, without thinking, with purpose. She never wrote on them, never stitched, but her folds were unmistakable, clean, sharp, always with 3 corners tucked and one left slightly raised, as if the message inside was listening, not finished. She left them all over, in boots, beneath bowls, tucked into window frames during storms. No one knew what they meant, but they knew when they saw one, something was being said, something careful. Lysa had no family, not by blood, but she had neighbors, and neighbors in her village were stronger than kin. When her roof collapsed one spring, 3 men arrived before she could ask. When her legs swelled from standing too long in the riverbed, someone left a folded cloth at her door with dried lavender inside. It wasn't medicine. It was presence. It said, "We see you, even when you don't ask to be seen." That was what the fold had become in that place. A form of quiet seeing. A way to hold someone without touching them. Then came the census, ordered by a nobleman no one had ever met, issued by a steward who smelled like old ink and impatience. Every house, every person, every item of value was to be recorded, not for understanding, for taxation, for control. The people complied, mostly. They opened their doors, named their sons, counted their hens. But they also folded. Cloths appeared at the foot of each home. No two were the same. One read, "You can count what we have, but not what we carry." Another, "Not everything named becomes yours." The steward didn't understand. He just called them decorative. But he walked faster on the way out. Lisa, as usual, said nothing. But she folded 12 cloths that week, all blank. She placed them at the church steps, on the schoolroom bench, beside the millstone. When asked what they meant, she said, "They mean we are still shaping what they try to measure." And everyone nodded. Because deep down, even those who didn't fold knew that measurement was a kind of theft. And folding was how they held the parts of themselves that couldn't be taken without consent. That same summer, a fire swept through the far edge of the town, not wild, just careless. A dropped lantern, dry air. 6 homes turned to ash before dawn. No one died, but something was lost. The morning after, folded cloths appeared on the scorched earth. Not gifts, not comfort, just markers. One read, "You lived here." That still counts. Another was tied to a charred beam and left blank. And that silence, heavier than words, told everyone who passed, "Don't pretend this didn't matter." The rebuild began the next week. Not ordered, chosen. And that's the truth. The fold had always protected. That value wasn't something granted by those with wealth. It was declared, folded, planted like a flag by those who'd been told their lives were worth less than the land they worked. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It didn't need to be. Because even lords eventually noticed when their taxes came slightly late. When tools were sharpened slower. When bread was baked just enough to pass. But never with the pride that made it rise higher. The fold taught this art of withholding, of waiting, of reminding power that usefulness can vanish when respect does. Years later, long after the steward was replaced and the nobleman forgot why he wanted a census in the first place, one traveler came through the town and noticed the cloths, asked what they were. The baker said, "Reminders," the teacher said, "warnings." Lysa, still folding beside the river with aching hands and steady breath, said, "Proof that they'd endured, that they'd remembered, that even in a world designed to measure and own and archive, someone had dared to fold a life that would not be flattened, and that fold would stay underfoot, overhead, unspoken but seen, somewhere deeper inland, tucked between forests, too thick for lords to bother claiming, and fields that never quite yielded enough to be taxed." Confidently, there was a hamlet so small it didn't have a name on any map, but it had folds, dozens of them, tied to branches, nailed to doors, weighted with stones at the base of fences. No one there remembered Tolan, not directly, but his shadow lived in their rituals, passed quietly, embedded in routine like salt in bread. They didn't need his name, they had his habits. In this place lived an old man named Ren, who folded cloth each morning before sunrise. His house faced east, and every morning the first light hit a row of folds lined up on his windowsill. He said it was how he remembered what mattered, not because his memory was failing, but because repetition made things real. His granddaughter asked once why he didn't write anything on them. He just smiled. Because some things don't need to be said to be understood. That became the way of the village. Their folds weren't declarations, they were anchoring. And anchoring, for people like them, was resistance in its purest form. When a new law arrived from the city requiring documentation of all livestock for regional security, the hamlet answered with a letter of compliance, and curiously, a folded cloth inside each envelope. Most of them read nothing. A few said, "Try counting what you've never fed." The clerk tasked with tallying the responses noted it was the most creative correspondence he'd received. He laughed. He didn't report them. He didn't understand he was looking at decades of quiet rebellion, folded small enough to fit in a pocket. When Wren passed, there was no priest, just neighbors, no sermon, just cloth. His granddaughter gathered every fold from the windowsill, strung them on a thread, and tied them between two trees beside the field he'd worked all his life. They fluttered in the wind like language, except there was no translation, only texture, only presence. "This is what staying looks like," she whispered to the sky. And those who watched her didn't cry loudly. They folded and hung their own next to his, until the wind could no longer tell where his folds ended and theirs began. Elsewhere, folds kept turning up in strange places. A tavern where workers gathered to rest and mutter about things they weren't allowed to say. A stables where the horses were treated better than the stable hands. A monastery where a folded cloth was found tied to a chalice with a message, "Blessed are the patient, but remembered are the tired." The abbot didn't remove it. He folded it again and placed it on the altar. Some of the younger monks didn't understand, but the older ones did. They had grown up in villages with cloth pinned to their shutters and folded into their pockets like charms. They remembered what it meant. By now, the fold had outlived the systems that gave birth to it. Feudalism frayed. The manor courts faded. Titles shuffled. But still the cloth appeared. Not because it was needed, but because it had become part of how people processed the unbearable. Folded cloth turned grief into ritual, turned rage into rhythm, turned helplessness into habit. Even when no one was looking, people folded. A woman folded after laying her father to rest. A man folded after losing a child in childbirth. A boy folded when he was told he would never inherit. They folded because the world didn't pause, but they could. And in all of this stubborn, silent continuation, the original question came echoing back. Why did medieval slaves have more rights than you think? And the answer, whispered not in law books, but in these folds, was clear. Because rights weren't just what you were granted. They were what you claimed again and again, in small ways too human to erase. The slave could be traded, could be broken, could be erased from the page entirely. But the serf, the bound, the beaten, the taxed, the tired had the fold. And the fold was the line they would not cross. A quiet claim that said, "I am here. I remember. I remain." In a valley village where winters came with teeth and left with silence, there was a tradition of folding cloths on the first night of snow. Not to honor anyone, not to mourn, just to prepare. For what? No one ever said, but the elders folded anyway. One cloth for every name they remembered, every name they wished they could, every name they feared would disappear. The children asked what they were for. The answer was always the same: in case we forget who kept us warm. And when that snow melted, the cloths were buried beneath the hearthstones, pressed into the places that would carry their heat longest. This is what the fold became, a storage of memory where history failed, when lords rewrote deeds, when names were erased, when taxes were raised so often no one remembered what a fair season felt like. People folded, because memory is heavier than ink, and because the fold required no literacy, no status, no voice, only hands, only care. only the unwillingness to let a moment pass unmarked. And so the cloths showed up again, this time in a place where the law had returned with sharpness. A new noble with old debts had taken control of 3 small towns. With him came papers, seals, and the heavy boots of hired enforcement. He said his goal was stability. What he meant was compliance. He instituted work quotas, curfews, marriage permissions, as though the old laws had never been loosened, as if time could be turned backward with the snap of a purse string. But people remembered, not just the hardship, the fold. They didn't protest, they didn't fight, they folded, quietly. One cloth left on the steps of the tax office. You can't own what won't kneel. Another tied to the guard's sword sheath. Fear is not loyalty, and we still know the difference. No names, no riots, but fewer hands showed up for work. Tools moved slower, food grew bland. Nothing was outright broken, but nothing excelled, either. He ruled over silence, and silence, as ever, was strategy. The noble grew frustrated, sent letters to higher lords, threatened the villagers with fines, public punishment, but still, no defiance. Just folds, dozens, hung like lanterns without fire, left on doorsteps, carried in baskets, slipped into the manor walls by those who still served inside. One folded square was found tucked into his own ledger, pressed between pages of debt. It read, "Your numbers are missing the people inside them." The steward brought it to him in silence. He burned it, and yet another appeared the next day, folded identically, waiting. Eventually the noble relented, not publicly, not honorably, but rules softened, punishments ceased. People resumed their rhythms, slowly, cautiously. No one claimed victory, because it hadn't been a battle, just a refusal to vanish, to flatten, to be rewritten. And the fold had made it possible, not by force but by anchoring, reminding people not what they could change but what they could claim, their place, their grief, their inheritance. And even now, under skies filled with smoke or cities humming with noise, the fold still lingers. Maybe not in linen, maybe not even in cloth, but in gestures, in the way someone places their hand over their heart without thinking, in the way one stranger leaves something behind for another to find, in the way people still refuse to vanish, even when the world tells them to be quiet, to move on, to comply. That is the fold still breathing, still here. In a hillside town where the wind never stopped talking, people began folding not just cloth, but paper. Paper was still rare, still precious, but it carried something cloth couldn't ink. Not everyone used it, not everyone needed to, but those who did treated it carefully. Words once forbidden or wasted on the powerful were now being slipped into the creases. We remember who we were before this silence. Your name is still yours, even if they mispronounce it. These were not protests. They were footholds. Because sometimes the only thing that kept a person standing was one folded truth in a pocket. One young girl, Maila, began folding her own kind of cloth, ribbons from broken dresses, scraps from her mother's mending pile, even strands of hay braided tight and looped. She tied them to trees outside her village, always with a single knot, always with a message whispered instead of written. She said the trees listened better than people. That might have been true. But more than once, someone stopped beneath those trees, saw the ribbons swaying in the wind, and left something in return. A coin, a line of thread, a breath, a pause. When the winter arrived, hard and fast, Maella's family ran out of food by the second week. Her father went to the steward for help, and returned with nothing but an empty promise and eyes that had stopped hoping. That night, Maella tied a ribbon to the gate of the steward's home. No threat, no message, just the ribbon. The next morning there were 3 more tied by others, and by the week's end the entire gate was wrapped in color. No one spoke of it, but when the next cart of grain came from the manor, the steward distributed it himself, quietly, unevenly, but enough to keep people warm. The ribbons stayed, long after the snow melted. Elsewhere, someone began folding inside books. A trader named Corin passed through towns and left behind folded pages with single lines marked, not margins, just small turns in the paper. A page with a passage about injustice, a chapter break with no explanation, a quote about mercy, underlined faintly. Those who read them didn't always understand, but something about the folds made them stop, read again, consider. Corin never said what he was doing. He didn't need to. When he returned to a town, someone would always thank him without saying why. At a crossroad tavern where pilgrims, merchants, thieves, and lost lovers all passed through, folded cloths began appearing on the walls, some pinned, some tied, some slipped behind cracked beams. Travelers left them after long nights. Locals added their own. A guard once laughed, calling it superstition. But the next morning, after a drunk noble accused him of theft and tried to have him flogged, someone left a folded square on the guard's shield. You are not what he calls you. No one saw who left it. But the flogging didn't happen. The cloths and folds weren't magic. They didn't stop war. They didn't end poverty. But they shifted things. Subtly. In the way water wears down stone. In the way silence stretches until someone fills it with truth. The nobles, even those who didn't understand, began to recognize the pattern. Where folds appeared, unrest followed. Not immediately. Not loudly, but consistently. And not all unrest was fire. Some was just a refusal to kneel. Some was just a field left fallow in protest. Some was just an entire village taking one slow breath together and not answering when called. And in all of this, the question kept returning, not as curiosity, but as reckoning. How could a class of people, considered property, be anything but powerless? But the fold had long answered that. Power isn't always noise. It's not always permission. Sometimes it's just presence that refuses to fade. A cloth left behind. A name not spoken but still known. A silence that says, you may rule us, but you don't erase us. That was the serf's inheritance. Not land, not titles, but a fold. And through it, a kind of unbreakable, undeniable right to remain. In a southern village surrounded by vineyards and stones too old for memory, the folds became part of birth. Not officially, not by rule, but by rhythm. When a child was born, someone, usually the mother, but sometimes a neighbor, a midwife, a stranger just passing through, would fold a small square of fabric and place it beneath the child's head as they slept. No words, no spell, just a shape, just a pause. It was meant as a shield, not against the world but against forgetting. You arrived, you mattered, even before they told you how to earn it. One girl, born under a sky so cloudless it felt suspicious, was given her first fold by the town's baker. No one knew why. He wasn't related. He wasn't particularly warm, but he'd folded a cloth during every delivery for years and said little prayers into them that only the dough seemed to hear. He placed the cloth beside the child and said, may she never need it, but if she does, may it still be here. It was. Years later, when the girl, Neva, stood accused of theft after refusing a nobleman's unwanted attention, the cloth was brought to court, not as evidence, as reminder. We were watching then, we're watching now. The charges vanished, so did the nobleman eventually. That was how it often happened, not with verdicts, with vanishing, with silence heavy enough to make power uncertain. Folds became warnings, not threats, just possibility. One cloth left outside a wine merchant's home after he docked. Every worker's pay for poor posture. Simply read, this vineyard will still grow after you're gone. Another placed inside a knight's saddlebag after he broke a stable boy's arm for a spilled pail. Not all beasts are horses. That knight returned a month later, limping, silent, said nothing, tipped well. The stable boy never saw him again. And yet, the folds weren't only resistance, they were balm. Villages used them as gifts. Now folded cloths, stitched with thanks, with grief, with blessing. One for the healer who worked through the night. One for the farmer who gave grain to those without. One for the woman who sang during storms and made children believe thunder was applause. Not because she wanted credit, because they wanted her to stay. And folded cloths became a way of asking people to stay, or a way of telling them, even if you go, you will not be forgotten here. A traveling cloth merchant, ironic yes, began cataloging the folds she found, not to sell, to preserve. Her name was Tyla, and she said she didn't believe in ghosts, but believed in weight. These carry something, she'd say, unfolding a cloth, like it was an old map. She never asked who folded them. She just noted where they were found, what thread was used, and if there was a scent, lavender, smoke, salt. Her ledger became a strange kind of scripture, fold with 3 knots, seen during drought, fold with crimson thread, always near old wells, fold without corners, usually grief. Her records were dismissed by nobles, treasured by everyone else. In the highlands, the fold turned into a kind of code among shepherds. When storms approached, when wolves circled, when tax collectors moved like slow frost through the hills, folds appeared on fence posts. A twist meant danger. A double meant prepare. A half fold meant stay low, stay kind, stay ready. They didn't always work, but sometimes they bought time. And time, as anyone who's ever hidden from injustice knows, is more valuable than gold and far harder to steal. And still, always, someone folded without knowing why. A child who hadn't been taught, a widow who didn't speak, a man who had never seen one before, and yet after burying his friend folded a cloth and placed it in the ground like he was giving the dirt instructions. That was the legacy of the fold. Not rebellion, not protest, but remembrance wrapped in habit. A sacred shape passed through lives no one wrote about, because power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just stays quietly, long enough to be impossible to remove. There was a monastery on the edge of a cliff, built so far from the heart of things it felt like the wind itself had forgotten how to speak. The monks there took vows of silence, but even silence had its exceptions. At the base of the chapel's altar, under the feet of statues and the weight of centuries, someone had begun placing folded cloths, not notes, not prayers, just folds. Each one different, each one purposeful. And though no one claimed responsibility, the brothers left them undisturbed. Some even started folding themselves, linen scraps, bits of cassock worn thin from kneeling. It became their own unwritten liturgy, fold for what you carry in silence. One monk, old and bent like a tired question, began teaching the novices how to fold as part of their daily duties. He said it helped still the hands and steady the mind. But when asked what it meant, he always gave the same answer. It means someone needed a way to stay when no one was listening. Some of the cloths were buried with the dead. Others were left in the fields after prayer walks, pressed under stones like offerings. None were signed. And yet every brother who folded said the same thing in time. I felt lighter afterward. In the village below the cliff, the fold became common language. A baker there, Ruin, sharp-tongued and quietly generous, began wrapping loaves in folded cloth on days when grief walked too close. You didn't ask for them, they appeared. One widow received bread stitched with, "You don't have to carry this alone." A father grieving a stillborn child found, "You kept breathing." That's enough. It wasn't therapy, it wasn't cure, but it was recognition. And recognition in places like this was more rare than rain in summer. Children began playing games with folds, trading them, folding badly and proudly. Look, they'd say, this one's for when my sister yelled at me, or this one is so no one forgets my goat. The adults smiled, said nothing, but they kept the folds, tucked them in sleeves, slipped them between floorboards. because sometimes even a childish fold was the only reminder that someone had noticed you still existed. Not every fold brought peace. In a neighboring village, after a steward whipped a man for stealing firewood in a bitter winter, someone folded cloth soaked with wine and ash and tied it to the church door. It read, "If punishment fed us, we'd be full by now." The steward tore it down, but the next morning, 3 more appeared. He stopped going to church after that. The priest, to his credit, began folding cloths himself, quiet ones, left by the fire for whoever needed them. He said they were meant for hands that no longer had the strength to ask. The fold by now had become untraceable. It no longer belonged to a region or a people or even a language. Nobles tried to claim they invented it. They folded napkins at feasts, folded letters with crests, folded maps before sending soldiers off to war. But their folds were sterile, decorative. They missed the point. Because the real fold, the true, humble, stubborn fold, wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to carry, to say what mouths couldn't, to stitch back the seams torn by time, taxes, or grief. And in this, the serfs had always been miles ahead. Their folds were never meant for display. They were kept in pockets, passed under tables, placed under pillows, and every one of them, in its own way, whispered the same thing. You can bend me, but you will not break me. You can claim my labor, but not my legacy. I am here, still, and that, more than anything, more than land or coin or parchment, was the right they had fought for, folded for, passed on. In a wide valley hemmed by mountains too jagged for conquest and fields too narrow for cavalry, the folds took on a new form, not in cloth, not in parchment, in earth. The villagers there, stonecutters, weavers and beekeepers with more scars than coins, began marking the corners of their homes with pressed soil, packed into shapes passed down like family names. 4 creases, shallow, a square, sometimes tilted, sometimes perfect. This is our fold, they said, not to carry but to walk on. When strangers asked why, they just replied, because some things are only safe when stepped on. No one could prove where the tradition started. Maybe it was born from the fold's earlier days, when cloth ran out and memory had to make do. Or maybe it was new, a shape that had waited in the hills until enough grief gathered to give it purpose. Either way, the message remained unchanged. When you entered a home, you passed over the fold. You pressed it with your foot. You acknowledged what had been carried before you. And if you visited often enough, you were asked to help pack a new one for someone else. In one household, a boy was born too soon. He didn't live long. No priest came, no bell was rung, but the family gathered and pressed a fold into the garden soil. 4 corners, 1 silence. And for months after, neighbors stepped around that spot with care, not superstition, respect. Because the fold had come to mean, we remember so you don't have to hold it alone. Further east, a town near the salt plains kept the fold in paper, but not written paper. Torn, colored, dyed with berries or boiled herbs. They folded in pairs, 2 people, 1 cloth, no matter how small. It became the town's answer to disagreement, not arguing, folding. When tensions rose over water, over marriage, over trade, they folded instead of shouting. It didn't fix everything, but it kept people at the table. Because folding required attention. Folding meant you still cared about the shape of things. A noble visiting once mocked the practice, saying, "If folding solved conflict, I'd fold my taxes into a dove and be done with them." He laughed. No one else did. That evening, someone left a folded square at his bedside table. It read, "Folding doesn't erase debt. It just reminds us who paid it." He left the next morning, quietly, paid in full. Elsewhere, in the ruins of a manor abandoned after a rebellion no one remembered clearly, someone had begun folding flowers, not into cloth, into the petals themselves, tulips mostly, soft, fragile symbols bent into tighter spirals than nature intended, left at windowsills, left on stones, left inside baskets where they would wilt quickly, but never go unnoticed. One woman, widowed twice and left childless by plague, folded a tulip every week for those who never got a grave. Her garden was the brightest in the village. Some whispered she was speaking to ghosts. Others said she just needed the silence to answer back. And throughout all of it, the paper, the petals, the pressed soil, the fold continued to do what it had always done. Turn the invisible into something tangible. The fold didn't demand recognition. It created it. It didn't claim space with noise. It shaped it with presence. And for serfs, for villagers, for those written out of the record books but never out of each other's memory, that was the right most worth defending. Not freedom in the way kings imagined it, but the right to name a moment, to shape sorrow, to leave something behind and say, this mattered, we mattered. Even when the world forgot to ask. There was a road, not a great road, not one built by Roman hands or walked by armies, but a trade path worn thin by generations of footsteps and wheels and unspoken agreements. Along this road, people had begun leaving folded cloths tied to the branches of trees. Just one per tree, always the same knot. Some said they were offerings. Others said warnings. The truth, of course, was more complicated. They were markers, a way for travelers to say, someone passed here, someone endured. One such tree bore a cloth that had been replaced more times than anyone could count. It always appeared just after it vanished. Wind took it, rain soaked it, birds picked at the thread. But each time someone restored it without asking, without credit. Once, a merchant tried to hang a sign over it, safe route, endorsed by Lord Halen. It lasted a day. The cloth returned. The sign did not. No one saw who removed it. They didn't need to. A boy named Darn once asked his grandmother why the cloths were always hung low, waist height within reach. She said, because they're not made to impress. They're made to be touched. And touch, in a time when most people weren't allowed to shape the world around them, mattered more than almost anything. It meant you are still allowed to affect something, even this. Some people folded as they walked, without ceremony, without speech. They'd tear the hem from their tunic. They'd pull a string from a sack. They'd pause, press a crease, tie it to a fence post, and continue on, like leaving breadcrumbs for dignity, like proof that their journey wasn't invisible. And others who passed would stop, press 2 fingers to the fold and move on. No prayer, just a moment. Just you mattered here. I see you even if I don't know you. In one mountain town, a traveler arrived during harvest. He spoke little, walked slowly, and folded constantly. Any scrap he found. He'd been through 3 famines, 2 wars, and 1 betrayal that hollowed his voice into something too thin for argument. But his folds were steady. He left them everywhere, on crates of apples, in piles of firewood, tied to the collars of sheep. He stayed the winter. When he left, he said only one thing. Folding kept me soft. No one argued. The town folded after him, not in tribute. In gratitude. Thank you for not hardening when the world demanded it. And yes, some mocked it. Some always do. They called it peasant superstition, or nostalgia disguised as protest. They asked, what good is a cloth when the crown raises taxes again? And the answer, though not always spoken, was clear. The cloth doesn't stop the hurt. It just makes it bearable. Because when your name isn't written down, when your story isn't taught, when your body is seen only for what it can carry or cut or clean, folding is a way of reclaiming shape. That was always the difference between a slave and a serf. Not just in the law, but in the legacy. The slave was stripped of shape, of family, of future, of legal protection. They were reduced to utility. But the serf, however bound, still had corners to fold, still had space, narrow, fragile, but real, to remember themselves, to resist disappearance. The fold didn't make them free, but it let them say, I am more than what I owe you. I am more than the harvest. I am not a line in your ledger. I am a fold in the fabric of this land, and you cannot unmake me. In a town that had changed hands more times than anyone bothered counting, swapped between lords, taxed by both church and crown, and forgotten by all until harvest season, there stood a stone wall no one had built. Not officially. It had grown, one rock at a time, over generations. Some said it marked the old border, others said it held up the sky. But what everyone agreed on was this: each stone had been placed with a fold tucked beneath it, not to bless, not to ward off spirits, just to hold something. Maybe sorrow, maybe hope, maybe the names that were never spoken out loud. No one dared dismantle it. Not because it was protected, but because it was respected. Every winter, someone would walk the length of it and brush snow from its surface. They'd leave no words, just small folded cloths, pressed into cracks between stone and time. Travelers who passed by were told, that's the wall of those who stayed. No one could explain what that meant, and no one needed to. It was there that a woman named Sorrel folded her grief. She'd lost 3 children in 4 years, 2 to sickness, 1 to silence. Her husband had left, not cruelly, just quietly, like someone walking out of a storm without looking back. She didn't weep publicly. She didn't speak of it. But every season, she folded a cloth, tied it with flax, and pressed it into the wall. Each time, the wall took it without judgment. And each time, Sorrel stood straighter walking home. It didn't make her lighter, but it gave the weight somewhere to go. One year, someone tried to build beside the wall. A merchant from the city said he wanted to build a granary. No use letting old stones rot when we could store grain, he'd said. Practical, profitable, unwelcome. The villagers didn't argue. They just folded. Every doorway bore a cloth that week. Every window, every gate. No slogans, just shape. The message wasn't resistance. It was remembering. And the merchant, seeing it, paused. Asked, "What is this?" The baker said. "It's everything that came before you." The merchant packed his cart and left before dawn. Elsewhere, folds were appearing in places where they had no business surviving. A prison near the coast, crumbling, bitter, forgotten by law, began to find folded scraps beneath cots, not by guards, by inmates, sentenced for theft, for rebellion, for debts too large to ever repay. They folded with thread from their own clothes, with straw, with pieces of bread. No one told them to. They just did. One guard, curious and maybe a little afraid, unfolded one. It read, "You caged me, but I still shape something. That means you haven't won." In the cities, folds began turning up in strange places, tucked inside coin purses, between the pages of tavern ledgers, folded into the pleats of noble garments, by tailors who didn't speak much but noticed everything. The folds weren't protests anymore. They were pulses. You could trace them like heartbeats. One noble found a fold in the toe of her slipper, left there by a servant she didn't remember hiring. It read, "Step carefully. The ground isn't as quiet as you think." She kept it, not out of guilt, out of awe. And still, in villages with names erased by flood or flame or the cruel indifference of royal record keepers, folds endured, passed down in recipes and stitching patterns and lullabies that paused mid-line, just long enough for a cloth to be tucked in. The fold had never been a rebellion in the way history liked to archive. It wasn't loud enough, but it had rewritten what it meant to survive with your shape intact. And every serf who folded, every hand that creased the corners of something soft and said, "This is mine and it's staying," had practiced a kind of freedom their masters never even saw coming. There was a village pressed into the crook of 2 hills where the sun lingered longer in the evenings, and the wind never stopped carrying other people's words. There, the fold became prophecy. Not because it foretold the future, but because it refused to let the past die unnoticed. Every child in the village was given their first cloth before they could speak. Not to wear, to keep. Folded once, no message. When they turned 10, the cloth was unfolded. And inside, somehow, always was exactly what they needed to hear. You're not too quiet. You belong, even if you don't know why yet. You don't owe anyone your softness unless they've earned it. Of course, the cloths weren't magical. They were folded by parents, elders, neighbors. But the magic came from attention, from knowing a child well enough to see the struggle forming before they had words to name it. One boy, pale and unsure, found, "You don't need to fight like your father did. You get to stay kind," he cried, folded it again, and kept it under his pillow until the day he left for the city. Not everyone understood. A traveling tutor, brought in by the mayor to civilize the local dialect, scoffed when he found a folded cloth on the lectern. It read, "You're not teaching, you're performing." He dismissed it as nonsense. But 3 students never came back to class, and the mayor, a week later, quietly asked if the tutor might shorten his stay. Beyond that village, along the riverbanks where mud swallowed boots and stories lingered longer than footprints, a ferryman kept a book of folds, not paper, just memory. He never wrote anything down, but for every person he rode across, he made a mental note of what they carried. Some wept, some hummed, some were silent in a way that felt too heavy to last. For those he left folds, tucked under a rock near the dock, slipped into their hand with the coin, folded in rope, soaked in brine. One woman unfolded hers mid-crossing. It said, "The water won't take what you don't give it," she cried the rest of the way across. But she left with both feet under her. In lands once ruled by families whose names now sat dusty and irrelevant in crumbling archives, the fold became ritual in other forms. A weaver in the foothills embroidered a folded edge into every shawl she sold, always on the inside where it touched the skin. When asked why, she said, "Because most people forget that comfort is a kind of protest too." She didn't sign them. She didn't charge extra, but her shawls lasted longer, wore softer, were passed down with the same reverence as folded cloths themselves. Even in courts, yes, even there, the fold found its way in. A clerk, low-ranking and painfully observant, began adding a fold in the corner of every notice about new tithes. Just a crease, subtle, but it spread. Other clerks mimicked it. Soon every decree bore that fold, and villagers began to notice. Folded corners meant unfair law. Unfolded meant safe passage. It wasn't planned, it wasn't official, but it worked. Like a whispered warning passed through generations of tired hands. By this point, the question had grown tired too. Did medieval serfs really have rights? And the answer, folded into thousands of moments like these, was this. Maybe not the kind scribes bothered writing down, but yes, absolutely. Because the right to endure is a right. The right to remember each other is a right. The right to fold what hurt into something that holds shape, that's more powerful than any seal on a scroll. Because seals break, cloth stays. Especially when it's carried in hands that know how to keep folding, even when no one is watching. Far to the north, in a settlement carved from stone and wind and centuries of endurance, the folds were made from wool, heavy, coarse, thick enough to hold warmth and meaning at once. The winters there were long and wordless. Days passed without conversation, and no one took offense. That was just how the cold worked. But in that silence, the fold said everything. A woolen square left on your windowsill meant someone was grieving. One tucked into your coat. You are being watched over, whether you asked for it or not. One laid on a stool beside the hearth. You don't need to speak, just sit. These weren't decorative. They weren't soft or pretty. They were survival stitched into habit. If someone in the village hadn't folded for more than a week, others would notice. They'd check in, not by knocking, not with words. They'd just leave a fold. One man, Tiern, whose hands had turned too stiff to weave anymore, hadn't left his home for days. A cloth showed up outside his door, then 3, then a basket of wool. He wept the next morning, folded something the size of a thumb and left it on the well. It said, "I heard you," that was enough. Meanwhile, in a town built around salt where people scraped the earth clean to find value, no king ever thanked them for cloth was rare. But the fold still found a way. People folded paper, yes, but also bark. Thin strips of hide, leaves even. And the messages weren't always soft. One woman fined for letting her daughter marry a shoemaker without approval from the Lord's steward, folded a strip of calfskin and nailed it to the manor's gate. It read, "You can bless a union, but you cannot undo love." It was removed, of course, but the marriage stood. In cities now grown too loud to hear anything not shouted, folds began to appear on thresholds, not homes, workplaces, stables, kitchens, inns. A cook who refused to strike an apprentice left a fold at the owner's door. Correction is not cruelty. A messenger left a fold on his own satchel after being scolded for delivering news too slowly. Speed is not loyalty. They weren't confrontations, they were corrections. And slowly, over time, the tone of power began to shift, not because lords had grown wiser, but because the people they relied on had grown quiet in ways that could not be ignored. Even across oceans, yes, even there, the fold found purchase. Sailors on trade ships began tying knots into cloth before departure. One fold for every home left behind, one for every person they didn't get to say goodbye to. Sometimes they tied the folds to the ship, sometimes to their belts, sometimes to the bottom of their boots, so that no matter how far they drifted, a part of them stayed shaped by what they left behind. One man drowned during a storm, but his cloth washed ashore days later, still knotted, still folded. His wife found it and wore it around her wrist for the rest of her life. And this, more than any law or doctrine or theory, is why the folds mattered, because they never asked for approval. They never begged for recognition. They simply became. They grew around grief. They shaped survival. They turned absence into acknowledgement. And no matter how many laws were passed, how many taxes invented, how many lords came and went with banners and borrowed authority, none of them ever found a way to undo what was folded. By now, the folds had passed beyond being a reminder of serfdom. They had become a living archive of everything that survived despite it, and every time a cloth was placed gently on a doorframe or pressed between two hands during a hard goodbye, it told the same story, not of rebellion, not of victory, but of endurance. The kind that doesn't need celebration, just another pair of hands willing to carry it forward. In a forgotten bend of road, near a village that no longer had a name but still had neighbors, there was a bench carved from old timber, half splinter, half patience. No plaque, no dedication, just a single folded cloth beneath it, kept dry under a slanted stone. People sat there without asking why. Travelers, elders, children carrying baskets too heavy for their backs. They sat and felt something settle, something unspoken pressing gently against their ribs, as if the silence beneath the wood said, "You are part of something older than exhaustion." The folds there changed with the seasons. In winter they were thick, stitched with wool, sometimes wrapped around sticks, so the wind wouldn't carry them off. In spring they were small and soft, tucked into crevices between stone and lichen. In summer, a woman named Bry folded leaves instead of cloth, each one etched with ash and wrapped in thread, pulled from her own sleeve. No one paid her, she didn't explain. "Some things you fold because if you don't, they unfold you," she once said. People believed her. They had to. She'd lost 4 children and still smiled like the sun owed her nothing. Down the hill, a new lord had taken the manor. Young, gold-eyed, raised in the capital with books and battles and little else. He thought the fold was a superstition, a bedtime habit, he called it. A peasant lullaby. He banned cloth on gates, ordered folds removed from village wells, had the stone at the old field, the one where people placed folded cloth for the dead, cleared away. The next day, someone placed a fold under his horse's saddle. No message, just a knot. So deliberate it felt like a signature. The horse threw him, broke his arm. He left the stone alone after that. Because here's the truth about power. It has no memory. It doesn't remember who fed it, who knelt beneath it, who bore the weight of its comforts. But people do. And when memory is stitched into habit, into shape, into the way you hold your grief, then power has something it can't touch. And that's what the fold was. Always. A shape that said, "You will forget us, but we will not forget ourselves." In some places they folded for joy too. A midwife folded cloth into the hands of new mothers. You did this, and no one can undo it. A carpenter folded small curls of wood and left them at doorsteps after mending things, whispering, "You asked for help. That counts." Even lovers used the fold, slipped between fingers during a crowded festival, tied to fences, left under beds. I see you, even when it's not safe to say so out loud. The fold didn't belong to pain. It belonged to presence, to anything worth naming. Children now grew up folding without knowing why. Their fingers learned the rhythm before their words did. It wasn't taught, it was copied. In the same way songs are hummed before lyrics are learned. One little girl, when asked what her fold meant, said, "It's for the parts of me I don't want to drop." That was enough. That was everything. Because even if the shape was uneven, even if the corners didn't quite meet, the meaning was always perfect. And so we return to the root of this journey, the unglamorous truth that medieval serfs, however bent by duty and dirt and debt, still had more rights than most people imagine. Because rights aren't always about what's written. They're about what's remembered, about what you refuse to let go of, no matter how many gates close. The serfs didn't rise in glory. They didn't conquer empires. They folded cloth. They shaped silence. And in doing so, they left behind a legacy of dignity no tax could take, no sword could erase, and no lord could fully understand. There was a woman named Elin, who lived by the boundary stones of a field so old, even the wind seemed to avoid disturbing it. She wasn't important, not by title, not by bloodline. But when someone died, people came to her, not for comfort, for cloth. She folded while she listened. She folded while others wept. She didn't speak often, but when she handed you the cloth, it felt like someone had taken the worst of it and shaped it into something small enough to carry. "It doesn't make it better," she said once, "but now it has form, and form gives us somewhere to begin. One doth." Elin never married, had no children of her own, but somehow every child in the village knew to visit her when they felt out of place. One boy came after being told he'd never be strong enough for the fields. Another came when he was caught stealing bread, not from hunger, but from anger. She folded for them both. The first got, "Your worth isn't measured in wheat." The second, "Mistakes don't make you unworthy of kindness." Neither boy spoke much, but both returned again and again, just to sit and watch her hands move, as if the folding itself was a kind of prayer they hadn't yet learned the words to. Outside the village, a road had been widened, cut through trees where folded cloths once hung. The workers, brought from elsewhere, didn't know the cloths were left for the dead. They cleared them, burned them, and paved over the soil. No one stopped them. No one had time, but when the road opened, no one used it. The carts turned around, the travelers rerouted. A week later, folded cloths began appearing on the side of the road, not as protest, as presence. This was sacred. You built over our silence, but you didn't erase it. The road eventually cracked. Trees took it back. Some say the roots remembered. Eileen died one spring just after the rains had softened the world enough to feel new again. She left no will, just a basket of folded cloths, each tagged with a name, Some bore messages, some didn't. One simply read, "You were never invisible, even when they looked through you." Another, "You stayed kind when the world told you to stop." People cried, quietly. No wailing, just the soft noise of being seen by someone who no longer needed to see them. They buried her with cloth, not flowers, folded squares from every home, some old, some made that morning with trembling hands. And when the grave was filled, they didn't mark it with stone. They built a bench, much like the one she used to sit on, and beneath it, folded into the frame, they placed one final cloth. It read, "Fold for those who folded for you." And that became the custom. Every time someone folded now, they whispered her name, not as worship, as gratitude. Far away, in towns Eileen never visited, her folds traveled. A trader carried one in the lining of her coat. A weaver stitched one into the border of a tapestry that would hang in a baron's hall, never to be explained. A mason, who'd never met her but heard her story, placed a folded scrap of linen into the corner of a new chapel wall, not for sanctity, for truth. "She folded so we wouldn't disappear," he said. "I'll fold so her silence stays loud enough to hold us all." Because that's what it had become now, not resistance, not even memory, but echo, the kind that doesn't fade, that grows quieter only so it can go deeper, the kind of echo you feel in your chest before you hear it in your ears. The fold wasn't just about remembering the past anymore, it was about becoming part of the future, one shaped crease at a time. And every time someone folded, they weren't just saying "I was here," they were saying "we still are." In the capital, where everything was louder, faster, and endlessly measured, the folds arrived quietly. At first, no one noticed. A scrap of cloth tucked under a tradesman's ledger, a folded square found in the lining of a servant's coat, a silk napkin with corners bent, not ruined, just shaped with too much care to be accident. But eventually someone began to ask. And when they did, they never got the same answer twice. "It's for a friend," someone would say. "It's for what I couldn't say out loud. It's for my mother who taught me to stay soft. It's not for anyone, it's just mine." The nobles called it quaint, then superstitious, then unsettling, especially when the folds started appearing in their homes. One on a balcony rail. This luxury came at a cost. Be sure you're the one who paid it. One on a glove. Your servants carry more than trays. They tried banning it, but how do you outlaw the act of shaping cloth? They threatened tailors. They burned a pile of folded linens in one of the public squares. The next day, that same square was lined with 100 new folds, each one silent, each one deliberate, a message louder than any riot. In one of the city's orphanages, the children began folding without instruction. They'd tear bits of their worn clothing, fold with tiny fingers, leave the shapes beside their beds, or in corners where no adult would look. One child, no more than 6, tied a folded square to a doll's wrist and said, "Now she won't be taken again." When asked where she learned to do that, she shrugged. "I just knew," because by now the fold wasn't being taught, it was being remembered, as if the soul somewhere deep and silent carried the shape through generations like a pulse. In the kitchens of great halls, cooks folded towels a certain way after losing one of their own to hunger. Ironically, in a house filled with food, they didn't strike, they didn't protest. They folded, stacked pans in 4s, rolled bread, dough into perfect squares, left folded parchment notes where only those who knew would find them. "She should not have gone to bed empty." That's all it said. But it stayed pinned on the pantry door for months, even after the steward changed, even after everyone who had known her had moved on. The fold also found its way into celebration. In villages that had once folded only for mourning or warning, they began folding for weddings, for births, for the rare moment when joy felt louder than fear. Cloths embroidered with laughter, corners tied with wild flowers, one fold placed in a lover's palm that read, This is not a promise. It's a choice I'll keep making. It wasn't just about pain anymore. It was about keeping the shape of something good, even when the world tried to crumple it. At the edge of one river, a bridge had been built by conscripted hands, paid in coin never delivered. Years later, someone returned and folded cloth for each of the names still remembered. 32 folds. No names stitched. Just initials. Just presence. Just presence. Travelers passing by were told to leave a fold of their own if they'd ever been cheated, overworked, ignored. The posts of the bridge were soon covered. Not graffiti, not vandalism, just folds. As if the weight of forgotten labor had finally found a way to rise without a word. And so the folds kept moving, past borders, past language, past the reach of anyone who tried to claim them, because they weren't owned. They were made, in kitchens, in fields, on battlefields, under blankets, behind locked doors, and each one said the same thing in a different tongue. You are allowed to shape this pain. You are allowed to hold this memory. You are allowed to exist as more than what they named you. The serfs had started it, but by now everyone who'd ever been bent by a system and dared to stand anyway had picked it up and folded it into their own life. There was a village where no one lived anymore, not since the sickness, not since the fires. The land had gone back to green, and the roofs had caved in one by one. But when travelers passed by, they saw something strange. Folds, dozens of them, some tucked into the old door frames, some pinned to trees, some simply set on the ground with small stones to keep them from drifting. The wind didn't scatter them. The rain didn't ruin them. They stayed, and no one dared touch them, because even if the people were gone, the memory was folded in place. One fold was placed on a ruined windowsill, a square of black wool, heavy and coarse. It read, "We fed each other when the world forgot to." Another tucked inside the broken mouth of a clay oven. The bread was burnt, but we were not. These were not memorials in the usual sense. There were no names, no dates, no prayers, just stories folded small enough to carry even after the carriers were gone. A man named Elric came through with his daughter. She asked why the cloths hadn't been stolen. Because grief, he said, is sacred when you can still feel it. She nodded. The next morning she folded a cloth of her own and left it on the path. She didn't write anything. She didn't need to. The fold itself said, "I saw you, and I will tell someone you were here." Back in the cities, folds were now part of daily life. Not official, not sanctioned, but constant. Workers folded after long shifts. Shopkeepers folded to mark a quiet success. A young man folded a ribbon after kissing someone for the first time and hid it inside his boot. A widow folded a cloth and tied it around her wrist during her first market day alone. No one asked what it meant. Everyone already knew, I am still here, changed, but here. Folding became part of how people handled the unbearable. A failed harvest, a betrayal, a miscarriage, a fear you couldn't name. People folded instead of breaking, and every time the act itself said, "This will not disappear just because I'm quiet about it." That mattered more than anyone ever admitted, because in the world that birthed the fold, where people were counted like cattle and taxed like dirt, surviving wasn't the miracle. Holding on to your shape was. And maybe that's why it endured, because you didn't need parchment to fold. You didn't need a voice. You didn't need permission. All you needed was a corner, and the belief that your life, your pain, your joy, your small moment of defiance deserved form, deserved to stay. No matter who forgot you, no matter what the law said, the serfs may not have had the power to write their stories in books, but they wrote them into fabric, into motion, into tradition, and in doing so they gave us something history could never truly erase. So if you pass by a cloth, folded and left without fanfare, don't unfold it, don't explain it. Just know someone lived here, someone stayed, someone mattered, even if no one wrote it down. And if you have something too heavy to carry, something no one else seems to see, maybe fold it quietly, carefully. Not to make it go away, but to give it shape. Because the fold, after all these years, is still the softest, strongest way of saying, I am still here. A small stone church sat at the top of a hill, overlooking 3 villages, none of which had pews to spare, but all of which had stories to give. The church wasn't remarkable. The roof leaked. The bell cracked. The priest was older than most of the walls. But what made the church matter, what made people walk hours just to leave something behind, was the line of folds tied to the rail that bordered the steps. There were always exactly 24. When one disappeared, another appeared by the next dawn. No rule, no schedule, just a rhythm too ancient to question. The folds varied. Some were new, some so old they'd frayed to threads. One was made from lace, another from sackcloth. One bore a single stitch shaped like a broken heart. One was stiff with salt. But all of them said the same thing in a language older than parchment. This happened, and we did not look away. The priest, who had long since stopped delivering sermons with words, would touch each one as he passed, never unfolded them, just nodded, as if to say, I remember, even if I don't know who you are. People didn't leave notes in the church. They left folds. A woman laid one on the altar after losing a child. A man folded a square and tucked it into the crack in the wall where he'd once hidden during a raid. A child left one tied around a loaf of bread as thanks for kindness shown when it was cold, and their mother hadn't eaten in 2 days. No one recorded this, but everyone remembered, and the remembering did what no law ever could. It made the unseen visible. Further out, in places where the land had grown hard and the people harder, folds became warnings again. When a field was poisoned by a greedy lord's runoff, the villagers tied cloth to the fence posts, red, torn, fluttering like flame. No words, just shape, just presence. The tax collectors saw and turned back, not out of fear, out of discomfort, because even they knew when the quiet people stop being quiet, nothing grows for a while. The folds returned to the manor weeks later, folded into sacks of grain, hidden in the seams of clothing sent back for repair. We are not your soil. We fed this land. You only counted it. And for the first time in years, the Lord arrived in person, not with guards, alone. He didn't apologize. They didn't expect him to. But he stepped around every fold he saw, and that, more than any words he could have offered, was the only kind of confession they needed. In distant cities, where glass replaced wood and coins replaced thanks, the fold lived on in hands that didn't even know its name. Street cleaners folded their gloves before storing them. Midwives folded towels after a long night and left them beside cradles. Factory workers in dusty corners folded scrap fabric into shapes too symmetrical to be habit. One woman, folding behind a curtain, whispered to no one, "My mother taught me this. She said it makes grief wait its turn." No one heard her, but the fold did. The cloth remembered. So, when we say medieval serfs had more rights than you think, we aren't speaking only about court writs and farming laws. We're speaking about the right to remain shaped, to remain seen, the right to make something out of suffering and pass it on. They didn't revolt to gain power. They folded to stay human. And now, centuries later, every time someone takes what hurts and gives it form, they are continuing that lineage. They are proving that legacy is not about who conquered but who endured and refused to disappear. In a far western village where the sea reached in and dragged half the year with it, the wind carried salt and silence in equal parts. People there didn't say much, and when they did, it was often with their hands. A nod, a gesture, a fold. The cloths there weren't fancy, just strips of sail, pieces of netting, rags bleached pale by sun and storms. But they folded them anyway, hung them above doorways, buried them under rocks before sailing out, pressed them into the hands of the sick and the dying. The villagers didn't call them tradition, they called them necessary. One man, a fisherman named Bell, folded a scrap of rope into his palm every morning before casting off. He said it kept the boat from forgetting him. When a storm took him and the boat returned without a mark, his folded rope was still in the hull, dry, untouched. His wife didn't wail. She folded it again and tied it to the pier. It's still there now, tattered, fraying, but it's never been untied, because it isn't about grief anymore. It's about witness. Not far inland, in a town built on stones too stubborn to move and stories too thick to leave, folds were left outside courtrooms. They weren't protests. They were reminders. One cloth pinned to the door said, "Before you rule, remember we already have." Another, tied around the judge's walking stick, "You don't carry justice alone. No one took them down." Not even when verdicts failed the innocent, because deep down everyone knew the cloths were not there to change the law. They were there to survive it. Children now folded without thinking, like instinct, a muscle learned by watching, not by teaching. A girl folded after her friend moved away. A boy folded when his mother didn't come back from market. They didn't need permission to grieve. They just needed fabric. One child folded a corner of their own sleeve and left it under a tree, whispering, "I hope someone folds for me someday." Someone did, not right away, but a week later, there was a new cloth next to theirs. Different shape, same silence. And in a market full of noise, where coin traded faster than names and everyone looked too busy to notice anything but profit, a vendor began leaving folds with purchases. A simple gesture, no message, just a crease. When asked what it meant, she said, "It means I saw you even if no one else did." Her stall grew popular, not because her apples were sweeter or her cloth finer, but because her hands told the truth people had forgotten they needed. That's what the fold had always done. Spoken for those who had no titles, no ink, no army behind them. It said, "Again and again, you may forget my name, but you will not forget my presence." And as the centuries passed, that mattered more than anything, because in the end, even kings are forgotten. But folded cloth, left behind with care, survives long after memory does. It outlives the story. It becomes the story. So no, medieval serfs did not live free. They did not live easy, but they lived fully, quietly, deeply. And they carved a kind of invisible legacy into the shape of everyday life, one that outlasted crowns, one that whispered to the tired, the overlooked, the bound, "Shape your sorrow, fold your name, be small but deliberate, and you will not disappear." There was a school built on the ruins of a field that had once been tilled by hands long buried and unnamed. The children didn't know that, not at first. The teachers didn't speak of it. The plaque by the gates made no mention, but every spring, before planting the little gardens outside their classroom windows, someone no one ever admitted who folded cloth and buried it just beneath the topsoil, always soft, always pale. The first child who dug one up asked if it was a mistake. An older child shook their head. "It means someone cared before we did." And just like that, the fold returned to the earth. Inside the school, the janitor began folding napkins left behind in the lunchroom, not because he was told to, because he'd seen something once, long ago, in a house with creaking stairs and a grandmother who always folded the laundry with the same tight corners. "It keeps the noise from building up," she said. He never understood what she meant until the world got louder. Now he folded, quietly, methodically, every time he felt invisible. Every time the kids yelled past him, every time a door closed too hard, he folded, and the quiet came back. In a crowded apartment in a city that moved faster than sorrow could catch up, a woman named Kell folded every receipt she didn't want to keep. She didn't shred them, didn't throw them away crumpled. She folded each one slowly, as if turning debt and disappointment into something smaller, something she could hold. She stacked them in a drawer no one else opened. One day her daughter found them, asked, "Why?" Kell just said, Because I couldn't make it disappear, but I could shape it, the daughter nodded. Started folding her failed tests the same way. Folds began showing up in hospitals, tucked under pillows, in prisons between mattresses and walls, in shelters inside shoes left by doors. No one knew who placed them. No one needed to. Some had messages. You are more than this moment. Your story didn't end here. You stayed alive. That counts. Others were blank, but even the blank ones said something. You are not forgotten, even if I don't know your name. In the corners of bookstores, between dusty novels and unread memoirs, folds appeared. Bookmarks shaped like wishes. Corners bent with care. A note left in the back of a second-hand novel. This helped me once. I hope it helps you too. A barista found it during a break. Cried for reasons she couldn't explain. Folded the note again and left it in a different book. This is how the fold moves now. Not in history books or footnotes, but between strangers, quiet, incomplete, alive. And if you're listening to this, wherever you are, maybe curled up in bed, maybe on a long drive, maybe cleaning a quiet room while your mind drifts, you're part of this too. You've carried something heavy. You've stayed through days that tried to forget you. Maybe no one gave you a cloth. Maybe no one taught you how to fold. But if you've ever taken a deep breath instead of breaking, ever shaped silence into kindness, ever held yourself with care when the world refused to, then you've already folded. You just didn't know it yet. So now, maybe you will. Maybe you'll find a scrap of something and crease it. For no one. For everyone. For the tired part of you that keeps standing anyway. The fold isn't magic, but it is real. And it has outlasted everything that was supposed to erase it. Because folds don't disappear. They just wait. Softly, patiently. Until someone new picks them up and carries the story forward. Somewhere between yesterday and tomorrow, in a house that didn't belong to history but somehow carried its dust, a man named Tom folded a cloth he found in a drawer he hadn't opened in years. It wasn't clean. It wasn't whole. But it was there, tucked between old photos and the kinds of receipts no one ever intends to keep. He didn't remember where it came from. He didn't remember folding it. But when he held it in his hands, something inside him stopped unraveling. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just folded it again, tighter this time, and breathed. In another part of the world, a girl who had never heard the word surf sat at a kitchen table folding gum wrappers into stars. She wasn't thinking about peasants. She wasn't thinking about tradition. She was thinking about how to hold still in a world that kept demanding she move. Each fold calmed her. Each crease said, "You are allowed to stay here right now." Her mother didn't understand it, but one day she began folding them too. Together they made a pile. It didn't solve anything, but it changed something. Back in a village, yes, one of the old ones, the kind that remembers what it's not supposed to. A group of teenagers started folding again. They didn't call it history. They didn't speak of resistance. They folded because one of them had lost someone, and no one knew what to say, so they folded. They left cloths on windowsills, tied them to fence posts, and when someone finally asked, "Why are you doing this?" they just said, "It helps." The question stopped being asked. The old stories are still whispered in some corners. The story of Tolan, who stood without standing out, of Miral, whose folds were straighter than most swords, of Rona, who buried grief and pulled back cloth. They are names wrapped in shapes now, more fold than fact. And that's how they remain. Not as saints, not as symbols, just as people who endured without being erased, who folded when everything else tried to unfold them, who made something soft out of something heavy. And the world, still heavy as ever, needs this, needs people who remember how to hold shape in quiet ways, who don't wait for applause to speak gently, who know that survival is more than making it through, it's making something from it, even something small, especially something small. A folded napkin, A note passed between strangers, a thread tied to a park bench, a cloth left where someone once hurt and never got to say so. Because now we understand the fold for what it truly is. It's not decoration, it's not resistance, it's not even memory, not really. It's permission to carry what you must, to release what you can't, to mark a moment as yours when the world keeps skipping pages. Every fold says, this matters, even if no one else sees it. And that truth has more weight than any crown that ever called itself eternal. So fold something today. Even if it's small, even if you're not sure what it means. Maybe for someone else, maybe for yourself. Maybe for the part of you that never got a story in the books. The serfs didn't fold to be remembered. They folded so they wouldn't vanish. And somehow, all this time later, you're still holding that thread. In the quiet hours before dawn, before the carts start creaking and the streets fill with motion, there is a moment, a single breath wide enough for remembering. It's in this space that the fold has always lived, not in the noise, in the pause before it, the space where the world resets its weight, and those who carry too much have a chance to put something down, just for a second. That second matters. The fold was made for it. And maybe now you understand why this story has taken its time, why it didn't rush, why it walked beside you quietly like someone carrying a candle through a hallway with no end. Because this was never just about serfs. It was never just about medieval life. It was always about now, about you, about the ways you've held your shape in a world built to flatten you, about the days you didn't break because something inside you folded instead. There's a truth most history books won't give you. Power forgets. It forgets quickly. It forgets comfortably. But cloth remembers, and hands remember, and people like you, people who notice the quiet, remember in ways no law ever accounted for. That's why this matters. That's why the fold survived, while the castles crumbled and the names rusted off the plaques. Somewhere, someone is folding now. Not because they were told to, because something inside asked them to. Maybe they lost someone. Maybe they're afraid. Maybe they're tired and don't want to say it out loud. Maybe they just need to feel like the moment they're in deserves form, not explanation, just shape. You'll never meet them, but you'll know them, because if you're still here listening to this, breathing through it, letting it settle, you've already folded too. This is what the serfs gave us. Not rebellion, not war stories, not monuments, but this, the right to remain, to be tired and still have a shape, to be bent and still be whole, to not be forgotten because we chose not to forget ourselves. That's not just survival. That's a right so ancient, so human, even the crown couldn't write it down. So fold something today, even if it's just a thought. Fold it softly, fold it slowly. Know that it carries more than fabric. Know that when you shape what hurts, when you give breath to what might have disappeared, you're part of a legacy older than walls. You're not just remembering them, you're continuing them. The peasants, the wives, the sons who left, and the daughters who stayed, the ones who made something out of nothing and passed it forward without asking for thanks. And if you ever doubt that this matters, if you ever feel too small to matter, too late to start, remember this. Someone, centuries ago, folded cloth, with calloused fingers and no voice, and somehow it still reached you. There's something sacred about the unnoticed, about the people who held the world together without ceremony. They never made the speeches. They never signed the treaties. They just stayed through cold, through taxes, through grief that didn't fit into words. They weren't heroes. They weren't saints. They were what came before hope had a name. And when they could no longer speak, they folded. That was the sound they left behind. And maybe now you see why the folds mattered more than the flags. Because flags were waved when others were watching. Folds were made when no one was. And it's in those unseen moments that the truth of a people lives, in the kitchen, in the field, in the breath between someone saying, "I'm fine," and someone folding something instead. The folds were never a protest against history. They were a correction to it. One last village, far at the edge of a forest that once burned and then forgot why, still folds every year on the same day. No festival, no announcement, just folded cloth, left on every doorstep, always before sunrise. No one knows who folds them, or maybe everyone does, and no one says, but they wake to find them, corners tight, no words, just weight. A shape held together by hands that still believe in the power of small, precise resistance. Every house leaves theirs somewhere different, in a window, on a table, in a drawer, with someone's name carved in the wood. The cloth doesn't change the day, but it changes how the day feels, and that's enough. You could live an entire life never knowing this story existed, never knowing that cloth once meant survival, that hands once spoke through creases, that whole lives were remembered without writing. But if you've made it here, if you've listened this long, folded into this slow unfolding, then the story found you anyway. That means something, not just about the past, about you. Because maybe you've carried something invisible. Maybe you've done the work that never got thanked. Maybe you've walked through life so quietly no one ever stopped to say they saw you, but you're still here, and you're still shaped, which means the fold has lived in you all along. Maybe you've folded grief into kindness, or silence into understanding. Maybe you've turned the rough parts of your life into corners that can hold others. If you have, then you're part of this, whether you meant to be or not. And when you think about those medieval peasants, the ones no one remembers until someone needs an example of suffering, don't remember them as broken. Remember them as folded, still shaped, still here, in the way we help, in the way we listen, in the way we don't vanish, even when we could, because that's what a fold really is. A decision not to disappear. And now, maybe you'll pass it on. Not with banners, not with shouting, just a quiet moment. A folded napkin, a stitched corner, a habit that no one taught you, but somehow you always knew the same way they did. This story ends the way all true things do, not with triumph, not with closure, but with a continuation you carry. Because the fold was never about winning, it was about withstanding, about shaping sorrow and dignity and hope so tightly they couldn't unravel, no matter how hard the world pulled. And even now, after all these words, after all these names and towns and years whispered back into breath, you still haven't heard the fold's full story. You can't, because it's not finished, because it's waiting for you. The cloth doesn't demand anything. It doesn't need to be understood to matter. You don't need to be a scholar. You don't need to be from the right place or speak the right way. You just need hands and something to fold, a moment, a memory, a feeling you don't know how to hold until you give it shape. And once you do, you've joined something older than kingdoms, something stronger than records, something softer than history has ever had the courage to be. And maybe, one day, someone will find your fold. Long after your name is spoken for the last time, maybe they won't know who left it. Maybe they'll never unfold it, but they'll feel it, in the way you once felt it, and it will tell them, you are not the first to carry something hard. You are not the first to make beauty from burden. You are not alone. So fold something, for yourself, for someone else, for a version of you that didn't know how to speak yet, but always knew how to stay. Place it somewhere that matters, somewhere small, somewhere safe, and know with all the certainty of breath that you have kept something alive. The serfs folded because they had to. You fold because you choose to. That's the difference. That's the inheritance. That's the quiet miracle. You are free to forget this, of course, but if you remember, if you ever pause in the middle of a day too heavy for words and shape something anyway, then you'll know the fold found you, and it never left. And if you found this story helped you rest, helped you remember, helped you feel something soft in a world too loud to hear you most days, then maybe leave a comment below. Let me know where you're listening from, what time it is, whether the fold is new to you or something you've been carrying longer than you realized. And if this kind of story holds you gently, I hope you'll subscribe, not because I'm asking for numbers, because I want you to know there's more where this came from, more stories for quiet nights, for still hearts, for people like you.